My sister was marrying a European prince, and I was expressly forbidden from attending. Your very existence is a stain on our pedigree, my mother told me. So I stayed home in my sweatpants and ate pizza. 2 hours into the royal ceremony, heavily armed royal guards kicked down the doors of my penthouse. The captain bowed deeply. His Majesty requests your presence immediately. The royal treasury has been compromised and we need the architect. I am Kendra, 34 years old, and my family has always treated me like dirt on their expensive shoes. Growing up in our supposedly perfect suburban home, I was the designated failure. My parents, Patricia and Richard, worshipped the ground my younger sister Brittany walked on. She was the golden child, perfectly manicured, socially aggressive, and ruthlessly ambitious. I was the quiet one who preferred dismantling computer hardware in the garage over attending country club mixers. When I dropped out of college in my sophomore year, my parents packed my bags and left them on the porch. They told everyone I was a useless tech support, nobody who played video games all day. They had no idea that I left school because I had discovered a massive zero-day vulnerability in global banking systems, a discovery that led me to secretly found Aegis Protocol. Today, Aegis Protocol is the premier private cybersecurity firm in the world. I am its sole founder and CEO, though I maintain absolute anonymity. The public only knows the creator by my moniker, the architect. We secure the assets of the top 1% global banks and sovereign nations. But to my family, I am still the embarrassing dropout. I sat on the custom Italian leather sofa in my penthouse, comfortably wearing worn-out gray sweatpants and a faded graphic t-shirt. The view from our floor-to-ceiling windows showcased the entire Manhattan skyline, a testament to the empire I had built from nothing. Beside me sat my husband Donovan. At 35 years old, Donovan was a striking African-American man with a brilliant razor-sharp mind. He was an elite corporate and international tech lawyer, the legal mastermind who helped me navigate international privacy laws while building Aegis. He was currently reviewing a massive merger contract, a cup of black coffee resting on the glass table. My phone buzzed against the marble countertop. I picked it up and let out a short, cold laugh. It was a text message from Brittany. The royal wedding aesthetic is flawless today. You and your husband's presence would be a stain on my perfect day. Stay away. Before I could even process her sheer audacity, another message arrived, this time from my mother. Do not ruin this for your sister. You are an embarrassment to this family. Stay in your little apartment and leave the elite alone. I did not shed a single tear. I had stopped crying over my family a decade ago. I just shook my head, smiling at the sheer delusion, and tossed the phone onto Donovan's lap. Donovan picked up the device, scanning the messages. His dark eyes narrowed slightly, but a familiar, knowing smirk touched his lips. He set the phone down and took a calm sip of his coffee. They really have no idea, do they? He asked, his deep voice rumbling with quiet amusement. I find it fascinating that they still think you are working some minimum wage IT job. I would hate to see their faces when they realize they just insulted the woman who practically owns the digital infrastructure of Europe. I reached for another slice of pepperoni pizza. Let them enjoy their royal fantasy, I replied casually. Brittany managed to convince Prince Edward of Valerius that she is some sort of modern tech prodigy. I have no idea how she pulled off that lie, but I am certainly not going to put on a tuxedo and a ball gown just to watch my parents fawn over her fake achievements. Donovan chuckled, closing his legal portfolio. I agree completely. I have zero interest in standing in the back of a cathedral, listening to Richard and Patricia brag about their superiority, while I pretend I do not make more in an hour than their entire neighborhood makes in a year. Besides, pizza and sweatpants easily beat a stiff royal dress code. We settled back into our quiet, comfortable morning. The contrast between my reality and my family's perception of me was a constant source of dark humor in our marriage. They believed they were the pinnacle of society because Brittany had managed to secure a royal engagement. They believed I was a failure because I did not boast about my bank account or wear designer labels to family Thanksgiving dinners. I preferred it that way. Invisibility was the ultimate armor. Suddenly, the heavy oak double doors of our penthouse shuddered. A loud booming crash echoed through the foyer, followed by the sound of splintering wood. The doors were physically forced open with terrifying precision. Donovan was on his feet instantly, his relaxed demeanor vanishing as he positioned himself defensively in front of me. 4 elite royal guards stormed into our living room. They wore pitch-black tactical suits heavily armed with the distinct golden crest of the Valerius royal family emblazoned on their shoulders. They moved with absolute military efficiency, fanning out to secure the perimeter of the room. I stood up wiping a crumb of pizza from my sweatpants, feeling my heart rate spike despite my trained composure. The captain of the guard, a tall man with a scarred jawline, stepped forward. He did not raise his weapon. Instead, he stopped 3 feet away from us, planted his boots firmly, and bowed deeply from the waist. "Miss Kendra," the captain said, his voice urgent and breathless. "King Alistair requests your presence immediately. The royal wedding has been halted. Our national treasury system is experiencing a catastrophic breach, and His Majesty gave us strict orders. He said we must find the architect." The ride in the armored blackcade was a blur of wailing sirens and flashing lights. Donovan sat beside me in the back of the reinforced SUV, his fingers flying rapidly across his tablet as he tapped into the Aegis Protocol secure servers to run a preliminary diagnostic. The Royal Guards drove with reckless efficiency, tearing through the Manhattan traffic toward St. Patrick's Cathedral. The media frenzy outside the church was already at a boiling point. News helicopters hovered overhead, and thousands of paparazzi crowded the barricades. The abrupt halting of a royal wedding had sent shockwaves through the press, and the flashing cameras illuminated the dark-tinted windows of our vehicle like a strobe light. We were escorted through a heavily guarded underground entrance, bypassing the chaotic crowds entirely. The air inside the cathedral's lower levels was cool and thick with the scent of expensive lilies and old incense. The guards led us briskly down a long, vaulted corridor toward the VIP antechamber located directly behind the main altar. As we stepped into the lavishly decorated room, I immediately spotted my parents. Patricia was wearing a gaudy, overly embellished emerald gown that looked far too desperate for a royal affair. Richard stood beside her in a rented tuxedo, nervously checking his luxury watch. When they turned and saw me walking into the room wearing gray sweatpants and a faded t-shirt alongside Donovan in his casual weekend clothes, Patricia's face twisted into a mask of absolute horror and fury. "What are you doing here?" Patricia hissed, marching across the plush Persian rug. She looked around frantically, terrified that an actual royal might see me. "I specifically told you to stay away. You look like a homeless person. Guards, why did you let these people in?" The royal guards completely ignored her, standing like stone statues by the doorway. Patricia reached into her designer clutch, her hands shaking with rage. She pulled out a checkbook and a gold pen, hastily scribbling a number before ripping the paper out. She shoved the check aggressively against my chest. "Here, $5,000. We paid you to stay away. Take this and get out before you ruin everything. You dropped out of school to play video games in a basement while Brittany built a massive tech empire with our house mortgage. She is marrying a prince today, and I will not let you sabotage her with your pathetic existence." Before the check could even flutter to the floor, Donovan stepped forward. His presence was commanding a silent, immovable force that immediately dwarfed Richard and Patricia. He smoothly intercepted the paper, glanced at the amount with a look of pure disdain, and slowly tore it into tiny, deliberate pieces. "You did not mortgage your house," Richard Donovan said, his deep, resonant voice slicing through Patricia's hysterics. His tone was surgical and cold, and Brittany certainly did not build a tech empire. Richard's chest puffed out, though his eyes darted nervously. "How dare you speak to me that way? We took out a second mortgage to fund her startup. Brittany is a genius." "You committed identity theft," Donovan stated flatly, stepping closer to Richard. 5 years ago, you used Kendra's social security number to take out massive fraudulent loans because your own credit was destroyed. You funneled that stolen money to fund Brittany's fake luxury lifestyle, buying her designer clothes and fake social media followers so she could pretend to be a successful tech entrepreneur. You pinned a mountain of toxic debt on Kendra, assuming she would never have the resources to fight back. The color instantly drained from Patricia's face. She stumbled backward, her hand flying to her throat. Richard's arrogant posture collapsed, his eyes widening in sheer panic as he realized Donovan knew exactly what they had done. It is called aggravated identity theft and wire fraud. Donovan continued, his legal mind laying out their crimes with ruthless precision. It carries a mandatory federal prison sentence. You did not build a genius. You built a criminal enterprise on the back of the daughter you threw away. And now you are standing in a royal cathedral pretending you belong among the global elite. Patricia tried to find her voice, shaking her head in frantic denial. You cannot prove any of that. We are family. You are just jealous because Brittany is about to become a princess. The heavy, ornate doors of the antechamber suddenly burst open, shattering the tense silence. Brittany charged into the room. She was wearing a staggering custom-designed, diamond-encrusted wedding gown that reportedly cost $500,000. The massive train dragged heavily behind her, snagging on the rug. Her perfectly styled hair was disheveled, and her makeup was smudged from sweat and panic. She did not look like a serene bride. She looked like a cornered animal. When Brittany saw me standing there in my sweatpants, her eyes bulged with irrational fury. She pointed a trembling manicured finger at my face. Guards, arrest her immediately. Brittany screamed, her voice cracking hysterically as she frantically gestured to the stoic men at the door. Throw her in jail. She followed me here. She is trying to sabotage my crown. She hacked the wedding. I know she did. Get this trash out of my palace. Brittany was hyperventilating, clutching the heavy skirts of her diamond gown, desperately trying to maintain her illusion of power. But the royal guards did not move a single muscle to help her. They remained perfectly still, their eyes fixed straight ahead, waiting for their true commander. The grand doors behind Brittany swung open once more, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. King Alistair of Valeria stepped over the threshold, his face carved from ice, bringing the full, terrifying weight of a sovereign monarch into the small room. King Alistair did not look like a man prepared to celebrate a joyous union. He looked like a man preparing for war. His ceremonial military uniform seemed to press heavily on his shoulders. His face was entirely drained of color, his skin taking on an ashen hue. Patricia and Richard immediately dropped their arrogant posturing. My mother smoothed her gaudy emerald dress and offered a clumsy, trembling curtsy. My father bowed his head, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. Your Majesty, my father began, his voice dripping with forced obsequiousness. We are so terribly sorry for this disruption. My oldest daughter has always been profoundly unstable. We will have her removed immediately so the ceremony can proceed. King Alistair did not acknowledge my parents. He did not even look at them. He walked right past Richard and Patricia as if they were nothing but ghosts. He stepped entirely around Brittany, completely ignoring her outstretched hands and pleading expression. He walked directly toward me. Donovan shifted his weight, his broad shoulders subtly angling to position himself between me and the monarch, a silent warning that, royal title or not, no one intimidated his wife. But the king did not harbor any aggression toward me. Instead, the most powerful man in Valeria stopped 2 feet away and bowed his head in a gesture of profound, undeniable respect. The royal treasury system is locked, King Alistair said. His voice was remarkably quiet, yet it carried the terrifying weight of a collapsing nation. We are bleeding $20 million a minute. The entire financial foundation of Valerius is being siphoned into a digital void. Fix it, architect. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that sucks oxygen straight out of a room. My mother gasped. Her eyes darted wildly between the king and me. My father took a stumbling step backward, his face slack with sudden, terrifying comprehension. But it was Brittany whose reaction was the most spectacular. The haughty, triumphant sneer melted from her face instantly. Her knees visibly buckled beneath the weight of her $500,000 dress. All the blood drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking hollow and terrified. For the past year, Brittany had paraded around the global elite claiming she was a generational tech prodigy. She had presented the Valerius royal family with a proprietary software called the Valerius Shield. She told them she coded it entirely from scratch. She offered this supposedly impenetrable digital fortress to the king as her modern dowry, a grand gesture to prove she was not just a beautiful American commoner, but a brilliant asset to their sovereign wealth. King Alistair had believed her. He had integrated the Valerius shield into the core of their national banking infrastructure, trusting his future daughter-in-law with the economic lifeblood of his country. Now that very shield was tearing his kingdom apart. "Your Majesty," Brittany stammered, her voice shaking so violently she could barely form the words. "There must be a glitch, a minor error. I can fix it. I just need my laptop in a few hours. Please do not listen to her. She is a fraud. She drops out of community college. She knows nothing about high-level code." Donovan let out a low, rumbling chuckle that sounded remarkably like a predator cornering its prey. "A minor error," he repeated, his gaze locking onto Brittany. "You stole classified military-grade encryption software, rebranded it as a vanity project, and plugged it directly into a sovereign nation's central bank. That is not a glitch, Brittany. That is an act of international cyber terrorism." King Alistair finally turned to look at my sister. The sheer disgust in his eyes made Brittany physically recoil. "You told me you built the architecture," the king said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "You told me your mind created the ultimate defense. Yet when my security council demanded the override keys to stop the bleeding, you gave them an encrypted file full of corrupted data. You do not even know the basic operational language of your own supposed creation." I stepped carefully around Donovan, moving closer. I kept my posture relaxed, my hands casually tucked into the pockets of my sweatpants. I looked at the panicked monarch, then shifted my gaze to my sister, who was now trembling uncontrollably. I just smiled. It was a cold, sharp expression that held a decade of suppressed anger and absolute vindication. "I did not hack anything." "Your Majesty," I said, my voice ringing clear and steady across the antechamber. "Your brilliant future daughter-in-law broke into my private server 5 years ago. She stole my raw, unfinished code. She stole the foundation of Aegis Protocol. But she is not a coder. She is just a thief. And because she did not know how to bypass the master sequence or change the foundational passwords, my automatic anti-theft protocol remained active inside the software she sold you. When your royal technicians tried to force an update this morning, my system recognized the unauthorized breach," I explained. "It triggered a defensive purge. Your treasury is not just locked, Your Majesty. It is initiating a permanent wipe of your entire sovereign wealth." The sheer gravity of my words hung in the antechamber like a guillotine. The silence shattered the moment Prince Edward finally found his voice. He lunged forward, his face flushed an ugly shade of crimson that clashed violently with his pristine white military sash. He stepped protectively in front of a sobbing Brittany, pointing a trembling gloved finger directly at my face. "You will reverse this immediately," the prince demanded, his voice echoing off the marble walls. "You are speaking to the future sovereign of Valerius. I do not care what petty sibling rivalry you have fabricated. You are committing an act of cyber warfare against a recognized state. I will have you extradited. I will have you locked in a federal penitentiary for the rest of your natural life. We possess absolute diplomatic immunity, and my attorneys will crush you and your little husband into dust before the sun sets today." Donovan did not even blink. He took one slow, deliberate step forward. The movement was smooth, completely relaxed, yet it carried the undeniable menace of an apex predator closing in for the kill. Donovan towered over the prince, his broad shoulders easily eclipsing the royal heir. He casually adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke navy blazer, a faint, mocking smile playing on his lips. "Your Highness," Donovan said, his voice a rich, dark baritone that instantly commanded the entire room. "I highly suggest you lower your finger before I consider it a threat to my client. As for your attorneys, they are going to be far too busy drafting your defense to file any lawsuits against us." Prince Edward scoffed, trying to maintain his arrogant posture, but I saw the subtle way he leaned back, intimidated by Donovan's sheer physical and intellectual presence. "We have royal immunity," the prince spat. "You cannot touch us." Donovan let out a sharp, genuine laugh. "Royal immunity applies to acts of state, Edward. It does not apply to commercial activities conducted on United States soil." When you purchased stolen intellectual property from an American citizen and integrated it into servers hosted in Northern Virginia, you engaged in commercial enterprise. Under the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act, you stripped yourself of any diplomatic shield the second that transaction cleared. The prince opened his mouth to argue, but Donovan cut him off, his tone shifting from amused to lethal. Furthermore, Donovan continued, his words striking like physical blows. The software your blushing bride sold you is classified under United States cyber espionage laws as protected critical infrastructure. By actively possessing and refusing to surrender stolen digital architecture, you are currently in violation of the Economic Espionage Act of 1996. If you want to talk about international lawsuits, I have the director of the FBI and the head of Interpol on speed dial. I can have federal agents raid your embassy in exactly 15 minutes. You are not holding the cards here, Edward. You are holding a ticking bomb, and you are entirely out of your depth. Prince Edward's mouth snapped shut. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified little boy playing dress-up in military medals. He turned slowly to look at Brittany, who was now weeping hysterically, clutching the heavy layers of her $500,000 diamond gown, as if it could protect her from the absolute legal slaughter Donovan had just delivered. "Edward," she wailed, her voice shrill and desperate. "Do not listen to him. He is lying. She is a nobody. She drops out of community college." I turned away from the pathetic display of the royals and locked eyes with my parents. Patricia and Richard stood frozen near the antique fireplace, their faces masks of pure shock. They had spent my entire adult life painting me as a massive failure to their country club friends. Now the illusion was shattering right in front of their eyes. I took a step towards them. Patricia flinched as if I had raised a hand to strike her. Brittany did not code a single line of that software. I said, my voice eerily calm, ringing with absolute certainty. She does not even know the difference between Java and Python. She stole my external hard drive the night you threw me out of the house. Richard blinked rapidly, shaking his head in frantic denial. That is impossible. You left because you failed your business classes. You were a lazy disappointment. I failed that useless business class you forced me to take because I spent 80 hours a week coding the foundational architecture for Aegis Protocol. One fired back, my voice finally rising, filled with the raw, suppressed anger of a decade of mistreatment. You kicked me out into the freezing rain. You packed my clothes in garbage bags and left them on the porch. And while you stood in the hallway screaming at me about how I would never amount to anything, your golden child sneaked into my bedroom and stole the encrypted drive straight off my desk. Patricia clamped a hand over her mouth, a choked gasp escaping her throat. I slept in my freezing sedan for 3 weeks. I continued stepping even closer, forcing them to look at the reality they had created. I ate ramen noodles and showered at a local gym while I rebuilt my software entirely from memory. And while I was fighting to survive the abandonment of my own parents, Brittany took my stolen prototype, slapped a new interface on it, and used it to secure a massive seed round of funding. She used my genius to buy her way into European high society. Brittany let out a loud, wretched sob, burying her face in her hands. She had no defense. The truth was out, ugly and undeniable, stripping away the flawless aesthetic she had murdered my youth to build. Richard looked at his youngest daughter, his golden child, and for the very first time I saw genuine disgust cross his features. He realized the terrifying truth. His entire life of luxury, the second mortgages, the bragging rights, the royal wedding, all of it was built on a massive federal crime against his own flesh and blood. Suddenly, a harsh mechanical siren pierced the thick tension in the room. Everyone jumped. King Alistair ripped his encrypted tablet from his jacket pocket. The screen was flashing violently, casting a harsh crimson glow across his pale aristocratic features. A robotic, automated voice echoed from the device, cold and unfeeling. Warning. Critical failure imminent. Total format of central treasury servers initiating in 60 seconds, 59, 58. Chaos erupted. Patricia screamed, covering her ears. Prince Edward lunged toward his father, panicking, trying to grab the tablet as if he could physically stop the digital purge. King Alistair shoved his son backward with violent force, sending the prince stumbling into a velvet armchair. The monarch did not care about the wedding anymore. He did not care about his family image. He was a man seconds away from watching his entire nation go bankrupt. The king looked at me. His eyes were wide, desperate, stripped of all royal pride. He stepped forward, raising his hands in a gesture of absolute surrender as the tablet counted down to 50. "Name your price," the king demanded, his voice shaking with raw terror. "Anything." I did not want his money. I reached over to the sleek leather messenger bag Donovan had slung across his shoulder and pulled out my compact laptop. I flipped it open, my fingers instantly flying across the keyboard. The terminal screen illuminated my face with lines of rapidly scrolling code. "I have more money than the Valerius treasury, Your Majesty," I told the king, keeping my voice entirely devoid of emotion. "I do not want your wealth. I want the truth." I tapped another sequence of keys, effortlessly slicing through the cathedral's internal audio and visual network. A heavy electronic hum vibrated through the floorboards as the massive speakers in the main sanctuary went live. I glanced at the countdown on the king's tablet. 45 seconds remained until the total deletion of his nation's economy. "I want her to confess," I said, pointing directly at Brittany. She was huddled against Prince Edward, shivering like a wet stray dog in her $500,000 gown. "And I want her to do it right now," into the royal broadcast microphone patched directly into the cathedral's main feed. "I want every dignitary, every head of state, and every international media outlet sitting in those pews to hear exactly how she built her fraudulent empire." My mother let out a guttural shriek. "You cannot do this!" Patricia screamed, her face twisting into a mask of pure ugly desperation. "You are ruining the family name. We will be laughingstocks." Patricia lunged forward, her manicured hands extended like claws, aiming directly for my laptop screen to smash it to the floor. She did not make it past the first step. Donovan moved with blinding speed. He caught Patricia's wrist mid-air, his grip firm and entirely uncompromising. He did not hurt her, but he completely immobilized her, using his momentum to pivot and force her firmly back into a heavy mahogany chair. "Sit down," Patricia Donovan commanded, his voice cold enough to freeze boiling water. "Your family name was ruined the moment you decided to fund a fraud using your actual daughter's stolen identity. You will sit there and you will watch the consequences unfold." 30 seconds, the king roared, his regal composure entirely shattered. He grabbed Brittany by the arm, roughly pulling her away from Prince Edward. "Confess right now, you foolish girl. Confess, or I will personally ensure you spend the rest of your natural life rotting in a Valerius dungeon." Prince Edward tried to pull her back, stammering about royal dignity, but the king silenced his son with a single furious backhand across the face. The sharp crack echoed in the antechamber. Edward stumbled backward, clutching his cheek in absolute shock. "Do not speak to me of dignity," the king spat at his heir. "You brought a thief into my palace." 20 seconds, the automated voice from the tablet announced. The red warning light strobed faster, casting frantic shadows across the stone walls. Brittany was hyperventilating, her chest heaving as she stared at the glowing green light of the microphone resting on the side table. She looked at me, her eyes begging for the mercy she had never once shown me. She had pushed me down the stairs of our childhood home. She had watched me sleep in a freezing car. She had laughed while my parents branded me a failure. "Kendra, please." Brittany sobbed, her voice breaking. "We are sisters. We shared a room. You cannot do this to me." 15 seconds, the tablet warned. I kept my hands hovering over my keyboard. "We are not sisters, Brittany. Sisters do not steal from each other. Sisters do not smile while the other freezes on the streets. You have exactly 10 seconds to tell the world what you did, or I let the protocol finish its job, and you go down in history as the woman who bankrupted a sovereign nation. 10 seconds. Brittany lunged for the microphone. She gripped it with both hands, her knuckles turning white. She pressed the button, activating the live feed to the thousands of guests, waiting just beyond the heavy oak doors. "I stole it!" Brittany screamed into the microphone, her shrill, hysterical voice booming through the massive cathedral speakers, echoing off the stained glass windows for the entire world to hear. I did not code the Valerius shield. I do not know anything about cybersecurity. I stole the raw hard drive from my sister Kendra the night my parents kicked her out of the house. I took her life's work, and I sold it to buy my way into this wedding. I am a fraud. I am a thief. I am so sorry. I listened to her voice echo through the heavy stone walls. I could hear the muffled gasps of the thousands of guests sitting in the pews outside. The international press, the global dignitaries, the European elite. They were all hearing the golden child of the family admit she was nothing but a common criminal. Richard stood paralyzed, his mouth hanging open. The bragging rights he had secured at the country club, the elite social circles he had bought his way into using my stolen intellect, it was all burning to the ground on a live audio feed. 5 seconds. 4 seconds. Brittany dropped the microphone and collapsed onto her knees, sobbing violently into the tulle and diamonds of her skirt. 3 seconds. I hit the enter key. A sharp, decisive chirp sounded from the king's tablet. The frantic red flashing abruptly stopped. The screen shifted to a calming, solid green. The automated voice chimed in perfectly neutral tones. Master override accepted. Threat neutralized. Valerius treasury systems fully secured. The heavy silence that crashed down over the antechamber was deafening. The only sound was Brittany's pathetic weeping on the floor. I slowly closed my laptop and handed it back to Donovan, who slipped it into his bag with a proud, subtle nod in my direction. We had done exactly what they demanded. We fixed the problem. King Alistair stood perfectly still, staring at the green screen of his tablet, as if making absolutely sure his kingdom was safe. He took a deep, shuddering breath, smoothing the front of his military uniform, gathering the fragments of his shattered royal dignity. He slowly turned his gaze away from the tablet and looked down at Brittany, who was still groveling on the floor. Then the king turned to Prince Edward. The look of absolute venomous disgust on the monarch's face made the prince physically shrink backward. The wedding is cancelled. King Alistair declared, his voice ringing with absolute terrifying finality. Guards strip the bride of the royal jewels and arrest her for high treason. The royal guards did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. At the king's command, the 2 men stationed nearest the heavy wooden doors stepped forward. Their thick rubber-soled boots thudded heavily against the polished marble floor. They flanked Brittany, who was still crumpled on the Persian rug, drowning in the massive, suffocating layers of her custom designer gown. One guard firmly grasped her upper arm, hauling her upward with effortless mechanical strength. The other guard reached directly for the blindingly bright diamond tiara resting perfectly in her meticulously styled blonde hair. "No, please!" Brittany shrieked, batting her manicured hands wildly at the armored guard. "You cannot do this! You are making a mistake! Edward, tell them to stop! I am going to be your wife. We are in love. You cannot let them treat me like a common criminal." Prince Edward did not move a single muscle to help her. He pressed himself further into the deep cushions of the velvet armchair, pulling his pristine white military sash tighter across his chest. He refused to even look in her direction. His cowardice was absolute and sickening. He had wanted a brilliant tech heiress to secure his own fragile position within the royal family hierarchy. Now that she was exposed as a massive liability, a fraud who had nearly bankrupted his entire nation, he discarded her instantly. He cared about his inheritance, not the woman sobbing on the floor. The royal guard showed zero emotion as he pulled the priceless tiara free. The heavy platinum pins snagged fiercely in Brittany's hair, tearing loose a long, expensive blonde extension. She let out a sharp, high-pitched cry of pain, clutching the side of her head. The second guard swiftly unclasped the breathtaking emerald and diamond necklace from her throat. The heavy jewels slid away from her skin with a cold, metallic clink. They were systematically dismantling the fairy tale princess she had pretended to be, stripping away millions of dollars of royal property piece by glittering piece. Patricia wailed from her mahogany chair, straining uselessly against Donovan's invisible, dominating presence. "You are hurting her. Have you all gone completely mad? She is the bride. You cannot touch her. She is a ward of the state." King Alistair corrected sharply, turning his back on the pathetic screaming scene. "Take her to the secure holding cells beneath the embassy immediately. We will determine her international extradition status after the treasury audit is complete." The guards hauled Brittany toward the heavy oak doors. Her $500,000 dress tore loudly, the delicate silk ripping as the massive train caught ruthlessly under a guard's combat boot. She dragged her heels against the rug, sobbing uncontrollably. Her thick, expensive makeup was ruined, running in dark, ugly rivers down her flushed cheeks. The grand doors slammed shut behind her, abruptly cutting off her hysterical cries and leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in the antechamber. Richard watched his golden child disappear into custody. His chest heaved with rapid, panicked breaths. He looked at the king, then at the closed doors, and finally his frantic, bloodshot gaze locked onto me. He did not see a daughter standing before him. He saw a financial lifeline slipping rapidly out of his sweaty grasp. He stumbled forward, his knees hitting the hard marble floor right at my feet. The sharp, cracking impact echoed loudly in the quiet room. He grabbed the hem of my gray sweatpants, his hands slick with cold sweat and trembling violently. "Kendra, please," Richard begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic, desperate whine. "You have to fix this right now. You have to tell the king you made a mistake with your computer. Tell him Brittany really did invent the software. You can just give her the patent. You have so much money now. You run a massive company. You do not need this one program. Give it to your sister, save her life." I stared down at the man who had raised me, the man who had packed my belongings in black garbage bags and changed the locks on the front door when I failed a single college course. "Give it to her," I repeated, my voice devoid of any warmth or familial affection. "You want me to hand over the core intellectual property of a multi-billion-dollar international security firm just so Brittany can play dress-up in a European castle and you can brag at the country club? If she does not marry the prince, we lose the estate," Richard cried, his fingers digging desperately into my leg. He was completely unhinged, abandoning any remaining pretense of paternal authority or pride. "You do not understand the financial leverage we used for this wedding. We promised our private creditors that her new royal allowance would cover our massive debts. If this wedding is cancelled, the bank will foreclose on everything by Monday morning. We owe millions, Kendra. Millions. You cannot let your own flesh and blood go bankrupt over a petty grudge." I looked down at him with absolute crystalline clarity. There was no sadness left in me, no lingering desire for his approval, and certainly no guilt. I gently but firmly pried his sweating, grasping fingers off my clothing and took a deliberate step back, standing shoulder to shoulder with Donovan. "You owe millions because you chose to steal my identity to live like royalty," I stated, laying out the ugly facts with brutal precision. "You wanted to impress your wealthy friends. You wanted to drive foreign sports cars, drink vintage champagne, and take luxury vacations, and you funded every single drop of that fake lifestyle using my social security number. You racked up toxic, fraudulent debt in my name, assuming I would die in poverty, and you would never face the legal consequences." Patricia practically threw herself out of the heavy chair, her heavily powdered face twisting in sheer outrage. "We clothed you for 18 years. We fed you. We gave you a roof over your head. You owed us that money for raising you. I did not owe you my future or my financial ruin." I fired back, my voice echoing sharply off the stone walls. "You placed a bet on the wrong daughter. You gambled everything you had on Brittany's ability to lie her way to the top of society, and you lost the bet. The Valerius treasury is secured, and Aegis Protocol retains full ownership of its code. I am not signing over my life's work to save you from the mountain of debt you accumulated by committing federal wire fraud. Actions have consequences, and yours have finally caught up with you." Richard collapsed forward onto his hands, pressing his forehead flat against the cold marble floor. He let out a wretched, guttural moan. It was the pitiful sound of a man watching his entire fabricated reality disintegrate into absolute dust. He had played a high-stakes game of deception for years, and the house had finally won. Donovan checked his sleek silver wristwatch, his expression perfectly composed and professionally detached. Right on time, he murmured, stepping slightly to the side to clear the pathway toward the exit. Before Richard could attempt another pathetic plea for financial mercy, the heavy side doors of the VIP antechamber swung wide open. The sharp, authoritative click of dress shoes against marble signaled a new arrival. Two tall men in sharp, unassuming gray suits stepped confidently into the room. They did not wear royal crests or tactical gear, but they carried an entirely different kind of absolute terrifying authority. They bypassed the furious king and walked directly toward my parents. The lead agent reached into his tailored jacket, pulling a leather badge holder from his interior pocket. He flipped it open with a flick of his wrist to reveal a shining gold shield. Richard and Patricia, the agent, said, his voice carrying the flat, unmistakable tone of federal law enforcement. "We are with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Donovan coordinated with our cybercrimes division yesterday regarding the fraudulent credit lines opened under your daughter's name. We have spent the last 3 hours freezing your domestic bank accounts and executing search warrants on your primary residence. You are both under arrest for aggravated identity theft and wire fraud." The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs echoing in the VIP antechamber was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. The lead FBI agent stepped forward and swiftly secured Richard's wrists behind his back. My father, a man who had spent his entire existence inflating his own importance and looking down on anyone he deemed beneath his tax bracket, instantly crumbled. His knees completely gave out, and the second agent had to physically haul him upright by the collar of his rented tuxedo. Patricia fared no better. She thrashed wildly, her heavy emerald gown swishing around her ankles as she tried to rip her arms away from the federal agent. She screamed that this was a massive mistake, demanding to speak to the chief of police, threatening lawsuits, and claiming diplomatic immunity because she was about to be the mother-in-law of a European prince. The agent did not even blink. He simply applied a firm, practiced grip to her arm, twisted it gently but immovably behind her back, and locked the steel cuffs around her wrists. The cold, hard reality of federal law enforcement completely ignored her country club tantrums. "You have the right to remain silent," the agent recited, his voice a steady drone beneath Patricia's escalating shrieks. "I highly suggest you start using it right now, ma'am." I stood next to Donovan, watching the two people who had thrown me away like garbage finally face the absolute destruction of their own making. There was no pity in my chest. They had mortgaged my future, stolen my identity, and ruined my credit simply to buy their favorite daughter a golden ticket into high society. They were experiencing the exact terror and helplessness they had forced upon me years ago. Brittany watched her parents being subdued from the corner of the room. The color had entirely left her face. The royal guards had already stripped her of the Valerius tiara and the emerald necklace, leaving her looking utterly exposed. Her elaborate $500,000 wedding gown suddenly looked like a cheap, ridiculous costume. She realized in that exact moment that her absolute shield of enabling parents was gone. No one was going to bail her out. No one was going to write a check or tell a lie to save her. Desperation is a highly dangerous thing. Brittany's eyes darted wildly around the room, landing on the massive, heavy oak doors that led directly out into the main sanctuary of St. Patrick's Cathedral. Out there sat 3,000 guests, global dignitaries, celebrities, European nobility, and hundreds of members of the international press were all waiting for a royal wedding. With a sudden guttural scream, Brittany gathered the massive skirts of her diamond-encrusted dress and made a frantic, clumsy dash for the doors. She was going to play her ultimate card. She was going to throw herself in front of the cameras, weep hysterically, and claim she was being framed. She was going to play the victim, just like she always did, banking on the world's sympathy for a weeping bride. She did not even make it halfway across the Persian rug. Prince Edward moved with a vicious, sudden agility. He intercepted her path, planting his polished boots firmly between Brittany and the sanctuary doors. When she tried to push past him, he grabbed her roughly by the upper arms and shoved her backward. Brittany stumbled, the heavy train of her dress tangling around her legs, sending her crashing hard onto the marble floor. Edward did not offer her a hand. The charming, polite facade of the royal heir completely vanished, replaced by a sneering, vindictive rage. "You are not going anywhere near those doors, you absolute parasite!" Prince Edward spat, his voice trembling with fury. He looked down at her as if she were a diseased rat. "Do you have any idea what you have done to me? You humiliated me in front of the entire global stage. You told me you were a visionary. You told me you were an equal. You are nothing but a common pathetic thief who dressed up in stolen money. You will not show your face to my guests and play the victim. You will rot in a cell for dragging the House of Valerius into your filthy, low-class scams. Brittany sobbed, reaching out a trembling hand toward him, begging for the fairy tale she had spent years plotting to steal. Edward, please, I love you. You love my title. Edward snarled, stepping back to avoid her touch. And now you will never have it. Donovan, who had been watching the exchange with cool, calculating eyes, pulled his smartphone from his jacket pocket. He tapped the screen twice. Let us make sure the guests are fully informed of the change in schedule. Donovan said, his voice carrying clearly over Brittany's weeping. He pressed a single button on his screen. Send. For a moment, the antechamber was quiet. Then a massive collective gasp echoed from the other side of the heavy oak doors. It was the sound of 3,000 people simultaneously reacting to something shocking. The cathedral had been outfitted with massive state-of-the-art digital screens suspended high above the pews. For the past hour, they had been displaying a beautifully curated romantic slideshow of Brittany and Edward. But thanks to Donovan's legal team, who had been standing by for his signal, those screens had just been hijacked. Through the slightly parted doors of the antechamber, we could see the brilliant glow of the monitors. The romantic photos were gone. In their place were stark, high-definition graphics of a live financial audit. Donovan's team had broadcast the undeniable proof of Brittany's massive trail of fraud to the entire congregation. The massive screens displayed the shell companies Richard had set up using my stolen Social Security number. They showed the wire transfers moving funds from fraudulent credit lines directly into Brittany's luxury bank accounts. They showed the exact source code of the Valerius shield side by side with the original Aegis Protocol blueprints, highlighting the exact date and time Brittany had illegally downloaded them from my IP address. It was a complete, irrefutable public execution of her entire false narrative. The whispers from the sanctuary grew into a deafening roar. The press members were undoubtedly scrambling, snapping photos of the screens live, broadcasting the greatest royal scandal of the century. Brittany covered her ears, pressing her face into the marble floor, wishing the earth would swallow her whole. Prince Edward stared at the screens through the cracked doors, his chest heaving. He realized the absolute magnitude of the public relations disaster he was currently standing in. The world now knew he had been duped by an American con artist. He looked desperate, realizing his reputation as a brilliant modern royal was entirely destroyed unless he acted fast. Then his eyes locked onto me. I was the actual genius. I was the billionaire CEO of Aegis Protocol. I was the woman who had just saved his nation's treasury with a few keystrokes. Edward instantly completely shifted his demeanor. The furious, sneering prince vanished, replaced by a smooth, desperate politician. He smoothed his military sash, stepped over Brittany's sobbing form, and walked toward me, offering a polished, thoroughly unconvincing smile. Kendra, Prince Edward said, his voice practically dripping with sudden artificial charm. This is a terrible misunderstanding. I was deceived by your sister just as you were, but we can turn this around. You are the true architect. You are the visionary I thought I was marrying. Valerius needs a mind like yours. I can offer you a royal contract right now. Chief of Cyber Defense for the Crown. Name your salary. We can walk out those doors together and announce a new partnership. It will save the day and make you a legend. I looked at the prince, taking in his pristine uniform, his desperate eyes, and his absolute lack of loyalty or integrity. I did not feel honored by his offer. I felt disgusted. I looked him dead in the eye, my expression colder than the marble beneath our feet. I declined his offer without a second of hesitation. I do not work for people who do not run background checks on their brides. 3 hours later, the sterile, blindingly bright fluorescent lighting of the Central Police Precinct provided a harsh, unforgiving contrast to the warm, golden chandeliers of the cathedral we had just left. I sat beside Donovan at a scratch-dented metal table in the main detective's bullpen, methodically signing my name at the bottom of the final page of my official federal witness statement. The air in the room was thick, smelling heavily of stale coffee, cheap printer ink, and industrial floor cleaner. Behind the thick reinforced glass of the holding cells, situated down the long concrete corridor, the remnants of my family were finally experiencing the cold, hard reality of the criminal justice system. There were no velvet cushions here, no deferential staff, and absolutely no room for their manipulative charm. We had spent the last 3 grueling hours laying out the exact digital footprint of Brittany's massive theft and my parents' extensive financial fraud. Donovan's elite legal team had already securely forwarded the IP logs, the forged bank loan applications, and the stolen source code directly to the lead federal investigator. The case was airtight. The evidence was irrefutable. There was zero room for negotiation or plea deals. The heavy steel door leading to the holding block swung open with a loud, aggressive metallic screech that cut through the low hum of the precinct. A man in a flashy, slightly ill-fitting pinstripe suit stormed out into the hallway. He had slicked back dark hair, an arrogant, overly confident strut, and a scuffed leather briefcase clutched tightly in his right hand. He looked exactly like the kind of sleazy, opportunistic defense attorney who chased high-profile celebrity scandals for a quick payout and a fleeting moment on the evening news. He spotted us sitting at the detective's table immediately and marched directly toward us, his face flushed red with manufactured theatrical outrage. Kendra Valerius, he snapped, slamming both of his palms flat against the metal table with a loud bang designed to intimidate me. I am Marcus Thorne, lead legal counsel for Brittany, Richard, and Patricia. What you are doing here today is a complete and utter travesty of justice. I did not flinch. I did not even blink. I slowly capped my pen, set it down on the table, and looked up at him with eyes as cold as ice. My name is Kendra, I corrected him, my voice dangerously quiet. I do not use their last name anymore. And what I am doing is holding thieves fully accountable for their crimes. Marcus sneered, leaning his body in closer across the table, reeking of cheap cologne and desperation. You are filing a false, malicious police report against the very people who gave you life and raised you. My clients are actively preparing a massive multi-million-dollar defamation countersuit against you and your little tech startup. We are going to bury Aegis Protocol in so much endless, aggressive litigation that you will be completely bankrupt before the end of the fiscal quarter. You will lose every single penny you have made. You owe them everything, Marcus hissed, his voice echoing loudly off the bare concrete walls of the precinct. They clothed you. They fed you. They put a solid roof over your head for 18 years. Your father funded your entire existence while you sat locked in your room playing on a computer. Any intellectual property you supposedly developed under their roof technically and legally belongs to the family estate. Brittany simply claimed what was rightfully hers. You are nothing but an ungrateful, vindictive child trying to ruin your successful sister out of pure, pathetic, low-class jealousy. I stared at him, absolutely repulsed by the complete delusional distortion of reality he had just been fed by my parents. They had clothed me in Brittany's torn, discarded hand-me-downs. They had fed me leftover scraps while she dined on expensive takeout. They had kicked me out into the freezing rain the very second I became a perceived financial liability to their country club image. They did not fund my existence. I survived entirely despite them. Before I could verbally tear Marcus Thorne apart and dismantle his ridiculous legal threats, a low, dark chuckle rumbled from the chair beside me. Donovan leaned back slowly, crossing his arms over his broad chest. He looked at the sleazy defense attorney with an expression of pure, predatory amusement. Marcus, Donovan said smoothly, his voice dripping with lethal elegance. What an absolute fascinating surprise to see you standing here. Marcus Thorne froze instantly. His arrogant, blustering sneer vanished in a fraction of a second, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a panicked ghost in a cheap suit. He slowly, mechanically turned his head toward Donovan, his eyes widening in sudden, horrifying recognition. He had been so entirely focused on intimidating me that he had not even bothered to look at the silent, imposing man sitting right next to me. Mr. Sterling, Marcus stammered, his voice suddenly shrinking to a pathetic, trembling squeak. I did not realize you were representing the plaintiff. I thought you were in Europe on corporate business. Donovan stood up. He was taller, broader, and infinitely more commanding than the sweating, shaking junior attorney standing before him. Donovan was not just my partner. He was the managing senior partner of Sterling Vance and Hayes, the most ruthless, expensive, and powerful corporate law firm on the Eastern Seaboard. He was Marcus's ultimate boss. I was in Europe, Donovan replied, taking a slow, deliberate step forward that made Marcus instinctively shrink back. But I flew back to watch my brilliant partner dismantle a global fraud. Tell me, Marcus, who exactly authorized you to take a criminal defense case involving federal wire fraud and international treason? Because it certainly was not me. And it certainly was not the executive board. Marcus swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he clutched his briefcase to his chest like a shield. I took it on retainer, sir. It is a highly publicized case. I thought it would bring the firm massive media exposure and good publicity. You took a rogue case entirely behind my back. Donovan corrected his tone, turning absolutely merciless. You saw a sensational, trashy headline, got greedy, and decided to represent the very criminals who stole from the woman sitting next to me. You are actively representing felons who attempted to defraud my firm's top client. Donovan did not yell. He did not raise his voice. He simply looked Marcus dead in the eye and delivered the final, devastating blow. You are fired, Marcus. Effective immediately. Clear out your desk by tomorrow morning, or I will have building security throw your belongings directly into the street. Furthermore, I will be reporting your actions to the state bar for a severe malicious conflict of interest. Get out of my sight. Marcus opened his mouth to argue, but absolutely no words came out. He turned on his heel and practically sprinted out of the precinct doors, abandoning his clients without a second thought. Donovan sat back down, picking up his pen with a satisfied, icy smirk. Brittany, sitting in a cold holding cell just down the hall, was now completely, utterly defenseless. The heavy metal door at the end of the corridor clicked shut, sealing Marcus Thorne's humiliating exit. Donovan calmly adjusted his tailored cuffs, the predatory satisfaction practically radiating from his posture. I watched the space where the rogue attorney had just been standing, feeling a profound sense of absolute closure. My family had relied on a fragile shield of arrogance, and it had shattered the moment it faced genuine power. A uniformed desk sergeant approached our scratched metal table, his heavy boots scuffing against the linoleum. He held out a bulky plastic precinct receiver. The prisoner in holding cell 4 is using her guaranteed phone call, the sergeant said, his voice carrying the flat, exhausted cadence of a man who had seen too much family drama. She requested the victim. That is you, Ms. Valerius. You do not have to accept it. I looked at the scuffed plastic phone. Donovan raised a single questioning eyebrow, silently offering to intercept the call and end this entirely. I held up my hand, signaling him to wait. I wanted to hear this. I needed to hear the exact sound of Brittany realizing she had absolutely no escape routes left. I took the receiver and pressed it to my ear. I did not say hello, I just waited. Kendra. Brittany sobbed instantly, her voice echoing hollowly against the cinder-block walls of her cell. The arrogant, entitled tech heiress was completely gone. In her place was a frantic, weeping child. Her breaths came in short, jagged gasps, performing a symphony of manufactured panic. Kendra, please, you have to help me. It is freezing in here. There is a woman screaming in the cell next to mine. They took my shoes. You cannot let them keep me in this cage. I listened to her theatrical weeping, feeling absolutely nothing. The cold, sterile air of the detective's bullpen felt entirely appropriate for this conversation. I am not letting them keep you anywhere, Brittany, I replied, my voice steady and completely devoid of warmth. You put yourself in that cage. You stole federal intellectual property. You committed wire fraud on a global stage. The FBI put you in there. But we are family, Brittany wailed, ramping up the volume of her fake tears. Her voice pitched higher, scraping against the edges of hysteria. We are sisters. We grew up together. We shared a room for 10 years. You cannot just leave your own flesh and blood to rot in a federal prison. I was always there for you, Kendra. I protected you from bullies in middle school. I kept those girls from making fun of your clothes. I am your big sister. My grip on the plastic phone tightened until my knuckles turned stark white. The sheer, unadulterated delusion it took to spin that narrative was staggering. She was actually trying to weaponize sisterly guilt using a fabricated history to manipulate me into saving her. You did not protect me from anyone, Brittany. I stated my words, cutting through her sobbing like a surgical scalpel. You were the ringleader. You were the one pointing out my worn-out shoes. You were the one telling your friends to ignore me at the lunch table. But that was just childish cruelty. What you did at home was entirely different. I let the silence hang for a single heavy second. Do you remember the wooden staircase in the old house? I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. Do you remember the day I won the regional coding competition when I was 14? You were so furious that Dad actually looked at my trophy instead of your cheerleading ribbon. Brittany's manufactured sobbing hitched, stuttering to a sudden nervous halt. I was walking down the stairs carrying my laundry. I continued forcing her to listen to the reality she had violently rewritten in her own head. You walked right up behind me. You did not trip. You did not stumble. You planted both of your hands squarely between my shoulder blades, and you shoved me with every ounce of strength you had. I paused, the phantom pain of that memory burning sharp and bright in my mind. I tumbled down an entire flight of hardwood stairs. I broke my collarbone. I split my forehead open on the bottom banister. And when Mom came running out of the kitchen, she did not ask if I was okay. She looked at the blood dripping down my face and she screamed at me for bleeding on her expensive Persian carpet. She blamed me for being clumsy, and you stood at the top of the stairs looking down at me and you smiled. I am not your sister, Brittany. I finalized, my tone absolute and unyielding. And you are not a protector. You are the bully. You have always been the bully. And now you are finally facing someone who hits back harder. The line went dead quiet. The hollow echoing sound of the holding cell was the only thing vibrating through the receiver. I waited for her to resume crying, to beg for forgiveness, to offer some pathetic excuse for her lifelong cruelty. Instead, a low, dark chuckle echoed through the phone. The terrified, weeping facade vanished instantly. When Brittany spoke again, her voice was completely unrecognizable. It was cold, venomous, and dripping with malicious, calculating triumph. The terrified girl was gone. The cornered rat had bared its teeth. You always were so self-righteous, Kendra. Brittany sneered, her voice echoing with pure, unfiltered malice. You think you have won just because I am sitting in a cell. You think you get to walk away with your billionaire boyfriend and your perfect tech company while I lose everything. You think you are untouchable now. I am certainly untouchable by you, I replied, refusing to give her an inch of satisfaction. Oh, you really think so? Brittany laughed, a sharp grating sound that sent a sudden spike of adrenaline straight into my veins. You think I walked into that cathedral today without a contingency plan? You think I would risk my entire royal future without having a loaded gun pointed directly at your head? Just in case you tried to pull a stunt exactly like this. Donovan noticed the sudden shift in my posture. He sat up straighter, his eyes narrowing as he watched my face closely, sensing the immediate change in the atmosphere. What did you do, Brittany? I demanded, my voice hardening. I ruined you! She spat, her words dripping with absolute venom. Before the FBI kicked the doors in, before His Majesty threw a tantrum, I noticed Donovan playing with his phone. I knew something was wrong. I knew you were going to try to expose the patent. So I took out my phone, accessed my secure offshore server, and I pressed send. I stood up from the metal table. The stale air of the precinct, suddenly feeling suffocating, sent what? Brittany's laughter was triumphant and vicious. I paid a highly exclusive, highly illegal underground tech firm to create a masterpiece. It is a flawless, high-definition, artificial intelligence deepfake video of you, Kendra. A video of the brilliant CEO of Aegis Protocol, explicitly detailing how your new cybersecurity software secretly harvests international bank data and funnels it into offshore terrorist accounts. My blood ran completely cold. "It looks exactly like you," Brittany taunted, her voice rising in a gleeful manic crescendo. "It sounds exactly like you. It uses your exact mannerisms." And I just blasted it to every major global news network, financial regulatory board, and tech blogger on the planet. "I might be going to prison, little sister, but your company's stock is going to flatline before the sun goes down. Aegis Protocol is dead." The line clicked and went entirely dead, leaving me listening to the harsh, unforgiving dial tone of my own impending destruction. I slammed the plastic receiver back onto its heavy cradle, the resonant clang echoing sharply across the concrete walls of the precinct bullpen. Donovan was on his feet before the sound even faded, his dark eyes instantly reading the sudden rigid tension in my posture. "Brittany pressed send," I said, my voice completely stripped of emotion as the adrenaline began to flood my system. She released a high-definition AI deepfake video to the global media. It shows me admitting that Aegis Protocol is a shell system designed to harvest international banking data for terrorist organizations. Donovan did not waste a single second asking useless questions. He pulled his smartphone from his pocket, his thumb swiping across the glass with a cold, focused urgency. The notification banners were already cascading down his screen like a digital avalanche. "It is already trending on every major news network," Donovan said, his jaw tightening into a hard, dangerous line. "The algorithmic velocity is unnatural. Someone is intentionally boosting the distribution vectors to cause maximum market panic. We need to get to the corporate headquarters right now." We sprinted out of the precinct, ignoring the shouted questions from the desk sergeant. Donovan threw his vehicle into gear the second my door slammed shut, tearing out of the police lot and merging recklessly into the heavy city traffic. I pulled my secondary encrypted tablet from my bag and bypassed the security locks, bracing myself for the digital carnage. It was a bloodbath. My screen flashed crimson with emergency alerts from every single division of Aegis Protocol. Our corporate communications director had left 14 frantic voicemails. Major financial institutions were initiating emergency protocol lockdowns, freezing our security integrations across their global networks. The Federal Cybercrime Division had already flagged our servers for immediate quarantine. The video itself was a terrifying masterpiece of synthetic generation. It played on a continuous looping feed across top financial news channels. There I was sitting in my exact office chair, wearing the exact blazer I had worn to an interview last week. The digital puppet wore a cold, calculating smirk as it outlined a fictitious, highly treasonous plan to siphon global banking data into offshore shadow accounts. The voice modulation was flawless, capturing the exact cadence and pitch of my real voice. It was designed to trigger absolute catastrophic panic, and it was working perfectly. We reached the Aegis Protocol glass tower in record time. Donovan bypassed the lobby security, entirely swiping us straight into the private executive elevator. When the polished steel doors slid open on the top floor, we stepped into absolute pandemonium. Phones rang incessantly, glowing red across the trading floor. Crisis management teams shouted over each other, desperately trying to reassure panicked clients who were threatening to sever multi-million-dollar contracts. I did not stop to soothe them. I marched straight toward the heavy glass doors of the executive boardroom, Donovan right on my heels. I pushed the doors open, silencing the room instantly. All 12 members of the Aegis Board of Directors were gathered around the massive mahogany table, illuminated by the harsh glow of the projection screen, playing the deepfake on an endless loop. Several international investors were patched in via holographic feeds, their expressions ranging from furious to terrified. Arthur Vance, the senior board chairman and our largest initial investor, stood up immediately. His face was flushed a dark, angry red. Kendra Arthur barked, his voice vibrating with barely contained rage. "The European markets are in a total freefall. The Department of Defense is threatening to rip up our contracts. We are hemorrhaging clients by the second. Look at that screen." He pointed a shaking finger at the video of my digital double. "The board demands an immediate explanation." Arthur continued, slamming his fist onto the table. This video utilizes our internal cryptographic signatures. The IP logs match your private office subnet. Some of our key investors are convinced you actually built a backdoor into our architecture. We have drafted an emergency resolution to suspend your authority as CEO immediately pending a full federal investigation. Several board members nodded in grim agreement, refusing to meet my eyes. They were terrified of losing their wealth, ready to throw me to the wolves to salvage the stock price. Donovan took a menacing step forward, preparing to unleash a legal threat that would have paralyzed the entire room, but I held up my hand, stopping him in his tracks. I did not need a lawyer to fight this battle. I needed my code. I walked directly to the head of the boardroom table, my face a mask of absolute calm. I bypassed Arthur Vance completely and sat down at the primary presentation terminal. "You want a federal investigation, Arthur?" I asked, my voice cutting through the heavy tension in the room like a scalpel. "I am going to give you one right now. Sit down and watch how the architect of this company dismantles a fraud." I did not wait for his permission. I pulled up the raw source file of the viral video directly from the media feed and loaded it into the Aegis proprietary debugging environment. I threw the command terminal onto the massive central projection screen, filling the room with lines of scrolling complex code. I initiated a real-time neural network weight analysis. I did not just look at the video. I looked at the math behind the pixels. "Look at the audio frequency graph," I commanded, my fingers flying across the keyboard with lethal precision. A bright red line spiked across the projection screen. That is a phase vocoder artifact at the 14 kHz mark. Human vocal cords do not produce a perfectly looping mathematical wave every 3 seconds. That is a synthetic voice clone built on a predictive algorithm. I typed another command string, injecting a localized illumination vector script into the facial mapping matrix of the deepfake. The image on the screen zoomed directly into the eyes of my digital double. "Watch the pupillary reflection," I instructed, my tone entirely steady. The ambient light source in the background of that video is positioned at a 90-degree angle, but the computational reflection inside the corneas is mapped at a uniform 45 degrees. The rendering engine failed to calculate the correct physics of the simulated light field. This is not a recording. It is a synthetic image generated by a deep neural network model. The boardroom fell into a stunned, absolute silence. Arthur Vance sank slowly back into his leather chair, the angry flush draining from his face as he stared at the irrefutable mathematical proof of my innocence. The holographic investors leaned closer to their cameras, their expressions shifting from furious doubt to profound awe. In less than 3 minutes, I had publicly and scientifically executed the deepfake, proving it was a complete fabrication. But I was not finished. "Now let us find out exactly who launched this attack," I murmured, my eyes locking onto the terminal. I compiled a trace route command, forcing the file's transport layer metadata to unpack its historical routing hops. I systematically stripped away 3 successive layers of encrypted proxy masking, drilling straight down to the initial source packet injection. The terminal flashed, pulling the exact geographic coordinate and network hub that had uploaded the deepfake to the international press. I stared at the resolved IP address, my blood running ice cold. The routing path did not resolve to Brittany's bank accounts, her offshore servers, or any underground tech firm. The underlying digital signature embedded in the code contained a highly exclusive, heavily secured royal credential string. The upload command was executed from a private sovereign network hub routed directly through the Valerius diplomatic embassy in New York. Brittany had not uploaded the video from the church. She did not have the hardware or the clearance. The deepfake had been deployed by Prince Edward. He was actively using his state immunity and royal servers to execute Brittany's revenge from the outside, desperate to destroy my company, to punish me for humiliating him at the cathedral. I did not pull back. I did not log out. I stared at the glowing royal credential string pulsing on my terminal and made a decision that would either save my company or land me in a black site prison for international cyber terrorism. Kendra, Arthur Vance warned, his voice shaking as he realized what I was looking at. "That is a sovereign network. If you touch that server, you are committing an act of cyber warfare against an allied nation. They fired the first shot, Arthur. I replied, my fingers locking back onto the keyboard. I am just finishing the war. I bypassed the standard defensive firewalls of Aegis Protocol and accessed the deep, unrestricted developer backdoor I had built for absolute worst-case scenarios. I initiated Protocol Icarus. Protocol Icarus was not a defensive shield. It was a highly aggressive, self-replicating counter-surveillance measure designed to trace an attacking signal back to its exact origin latch onto the host server and violently rip open its internal directory. It was designed to fly directly into the sun and drag the attacker down with it. Donovan, I said, not taking my eyes off the cascading code. Get ready to catch. I slammed the enter key. The massive projection screen in the boardroom went completely black for a fraction of a second before exploding into a furious blur of green data streams. Protocol Icarus hijacked the open connection Prince Edward had carelessly left exposed when he uploaded the deepfake. Because he had used his elite royal clearance to bypass his own embassy's security filters, he had essentially handed me the master key to his personal digital vault. It took Icarus exactly 32 seconds to shred the encryption on Edward's private offshore server bank. The data that flooded my screen had absolutely nothing to do with Brittany or the fake video. It was an astonishing, meticulously detailed ledger of extreme financial corruption. Look at these routing numbers, I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper as the board members crowded around the projection wall. These are direct, unauthorized transfers from the Valerius National Treasury. He is not just funding a smear campaign against me. He is actively embezzling from his own father. I pulled up the hidden offshore accounts, projecting the staggering balances for the entire room to see. Prince Edward had secretly siphoned over $400 million into a massive network of untraceable slush funds in the Cayman Islands and Cyprus. He had been quietly bleeding his nation dry for years, hiding behind his diplomatic immunity and a facade of royal incompetence. He used these slush funds to pay the underground tech firm for the deepfake, I explained, tracing the exact digital wire transfer from a Cypriot shell company directly to a known black market developer collective. He left a perfect financial paper trail linking him to the defamation attack, and in the process, he accidentally handed me the evidence of his treason. Donovan moved with lethal predatory speed. He pulled a secure flash drive from his tailored suit jacket and plugged it directly into my terminal. Download the raw ledger data right now, Donovan commanded, his dark eyes burning with absolute ruthless triumph. Strip the extraction metadata to protect your breach protocol. I want the shell company registrations, the treasury wire transfers, and the exact receipt for the deepfake commission. I isolated the encrypted files, sterilized my digital fingerprints from the extraction code, and dumped the entire mountain of evidence directly onto Donovan's drive. What are you going to do with that? Arthur Vance asked, wiping cold sweat from his forehead. You cannot blackmail a foreign royal. I do not blackmail, Donovan replied smoothly, pulling the drive from the terminal and slipping it back into his pocket. I litigate, and I enforce the law. Donovan did not pause to debate corporate ethics. He stepped out into the chaotic executive hallway and immediately mobilized his entire elite legal team. He moved with the terrifying efficiency of a man who held the power to topple empires. Within 20 minutes, Donovan had legally packaged the stolen ledger data, fully verifying the offshore shell companies using his firm's international banking contacts. He did not just send a quiet, threatening email to the Valerius royal family. He went for the absolute jugular. Using a secure, encrypted legal distribution network, Donovan sent the entire undeniable financial dossier directly to the private, highly classified, secure terminal of King Alistair. But Donovan did not stop there. To ensure the king could not simply bury his son's treason behind palace walls, Donovan simultaneously forwarded the exact same explosive dossier to the editorial boards of the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, and the global desk of Reuters. The deepfake video of me was already old news. The international financial markets were about to experience an entirely different kind of earthquake. I sat back in my chair, the chaotic noise of my boardroom fading into the background. We had completely neutralized the threat. Aegis Protocol's PR team was already issuing the forensic proof of the deepfake to our clients, and the market panic was beginning to stabilize. An hour later, my encrypted private terminal chimed with a high-priority alert. The notification bypass was coded with a maximum-tier diplomatic override. I opened the message. It was a single, terrifyingly brief line of text, originating directly from the Royal Valerius Guard Command Center. Your presence is demanded immediately. Donovan stepped back into the boardroom, his phone pressed to his ear. He ended the call and looked at me, his expression entirely unreadable. That was the Royal Diplomatic Liaison, Donovan said, his voice quiet, but carrying a heavy, undeniable weight. King Alistair has just landed in New York. He has commandeered the entire penthouse suite at the Plaza Hotel. The Secret Service and his personal royal guard have locked down the top 3 floors. I stood up, smoothing the front of my blazer, my heart hammering a furious rhythm against my ribs. Did he request a meeting? It is not a request, Donovan corrected, adjusting his cuffs with cold precision. It is a summons. The king wants to see the woman who just exposed his heir to the world. We left the headquarters immediately, taking Donovan's private car straight into the heart of Manhattan. The drive was tense, the silence heavy with the realization of the absolute firestorm we had just ignited. When we pulled up to the Plaza Hotel, the perimeter was swarming with federal agents and heavily armed diplomatic security. We were escorted through a private service elevator, bypassing the civilian lobby entirely. 2 massive royal guards wearing tailored suits and earpieces patted us down outside the heavy oak double doors of the penthouse suite. They did not speak a single word as they pushed the doors open, ushering us into the cavernous, opulent room. The penthouse was breathtaking, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the sprawling green expanse of Central Park. But the beauty of the room was entirely overshadowed by the suffocating tension hanging in the air. King Alistair stood by the window, his back rigid, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. But he was not alone. Sitting on a plush velvet sofa in the center of the room, looking bruised, terrified, and violently furious, was Prince Edward. He glared at me, his eyes burning with raw, desperate hatred. We had walked directly into the lion's den. The heavy oak doors of the penthouse clicked shut behind us, echoing like a gavel striking a wooden block. Prince Edward shot up from the plush velvet sofa. His normally immaculate royal grooming was completely destroyed. His expensive silk tie was loosened and askew. His hair was wildly disheveled, and his hands were trembling with a toxic, volatile mixture of raw fear and explosive rage. He pointed a shaking, accusing finger directly at me. "Arrest her!" Edward screamed, his voice cracking under the intense pressure of his own panic. "Arrest this corporate spy right now. She hacked a sovereign network. She committed an act of cyber-terrorism against the royal crown." King Alistair did not turn around from the window immediately. The silence in the opulent penthouse was absolute, thick and suffocating, broken only by the prince's frantic, uneven breathing and the distant, muffled sound of city traffic far below. I stepped forward, my posture perfectly rigid, and dropped my heavy leather bag onto the polished glass coffee table. I defended my company from a state-sponsored deepfake attack. Edward I stated my voice, echoing with icy authority. And in the process of tracing your cowardly digital footprint, I found the $400 million you embezzled from your own country's national treasury. Edward's face instantly drained of all color, turning a sickly pallid gray. But his terror quickly mutated into pure, unhinged aggression. He turned sharply to the 2 massive royal security details standing like stone statues by the entryway. They were his personal detail men who had sworn loyalty to the prince. "Seize her bag!" Edward commanded, saliva flying from his lips as he lost all royal composure. "Take her laptop. Destroy the hardware immediately. That is a direct order from your future king. Do it right now." The 2 heavily armed guards hesitated for a fraction of a second, exchanging a brief, uncertain glance before stepping forward in unison, their hands reaching inside their tailored suit jackets. Donovan moved instantly. He did not reach for a weapon. He simply shifted his stance with lethal grace, placing his broad frame directly between me and the advancing guards, turning his body into a physical, impenetrable barrier. The cold, calculated violence burning in Donovan's dark eyes made the two trained professionals freeze in their tracks. "Take one more step," Donovan said, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet, gravelly register that promised absolute destruction, "and I will personally ensure you spend the rest of your natural lives rotting in a federal penitentiary for assaulting American citizens on domestic soil. Your diplomatic immunity does not cover corporate espionage, armed robbery, and physical assault. I will ruin you, your families, and your pensions." "They are my royal guards!" Edward shrieked, his voice reaching a hysterical pitch. "They follow my commands. Take the machine, break it, stand down." The voice was not loud, but it carried the terrifying, undeniable weight of absolute sovereign authority. King Alastair finally turned away from the sprawling view of the city skyline. His face was a rigid mask of cold, regal fury. He looked at the two guards, his eyes narrowing with a dangerous intensity. "If either of you touches that woman or her property, I will have you tried for treason before the sun rises." The king stated, his tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. The guards instantly stepped back, lowering their hands and bowing their heads in complete, immediate submission to the reigning monarch. Edward whipped around to face his father, his eyes wide with desperate, sweaty panic. "Father, you cannot listen to her. She fabricated the data. She altered the code. She is trying to ruin me because I rejected her sister and threw them out of the palace. It is an elaborate setup." King Alastair walked slowly across the penthouse, his footsteps heavy and deliberate on the expensive hardwood floor. He stopped right in front of his sweating, trembling son. The king reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a highly secure encrypted royal tablet. The screen displayed the exact financial ledger I had extracted from Edward's offshore servers. "Do not insult my intelligence, Edward," the king said, his voice dripping with absolute profound disgust. "Mr. Sterling sent this entire dossier directly to my private classified terminal. I spent the last hour having my personal forensic accountants verify every single wire transfer. I saw the shell companies registered in Cyprus. I saw the diverted tax revenues meant for our public infrastructure. I saw the exact digital receipt for the underground tech firm you hired to create that disgusting fake video." "Father, please, I can explain everything," Edward stammered, visibly shrinking backward under the king's crushing, disappointed gaze. "You stole from your own people." King Alastair continued, his tone entirely merciless. "You financed a criminal smear campaign against an innocent American business owner simply to protect a petty, fraudulent socialite you foolishly brought into my palace. You have disgraced the Valerius name on a global stage. You have endangered our economy and our international diplomatic standing." The king turned his attention away from his pathetic son and looked directly at me. For a moment, the harsh, unforgiving rigidity in his eyes softened into something resembling genuine, profound respect. "Ms. Valerius," the king said, addressing me formally, his voice carrying a note of deep regret, "I owe you a profound personal apology. My son utilized diplomatic resources to attack your livelihood. You had every legal and moral right to defend yourself. Your software is not just secure, it is impenetrable. You have single-handedly exposed a toxic rot within my own house that I was entirely too blind to see." "Thank you, Your Majesty," I replied, keeping my posture perfectly straight and my voice respectful. "I only wanted the truth exposed so I could protect my company." King Alastair nodded once, a sharp, definitive motion of acknowledgement. He turned his attention back to the trembling, sweating prince. "Edward," the king announced, his voice ringing with absolute terrifying finality. "As of this exact moment, you are formally stripped of all royal titles, duties, and privileges. You are hereby removed from the line of succession. You are no longer the Duke of Valerius. You are no longer my heir." Edward gasped loudly, his knees buckling slightly, as if he had been physically struck by a heavy blow. "Father, no. You cannot do this to me. I am your son." "I have already contacted the Chancellor of the Royal Treasury," the king continued, completely ignoring his son's pathetic pleading. "Every single one of your domestic and international assets has been frozen. Your diplomatic immunity is officially revoked. You are nothing but a common citizen now, Edward, and you will face the full, unshielded weight of international law for your massive financial crimes." The reality of the king's devastating decree crashed down over the penthouse. Edward had lost absolutely everything. The limitless power, the endless money, the royal protection. It was all completely gone in an instant. He was a disgraced, broke international criminal. I watched the arrogant prince shatter into a million pieces. His chest heaved with ragged breaths. His face contorted from sheer despair into a mask of pure, feral rage. He looked at his father, then his bloodshot eyes locked directly onto me. The sheer, unadulterated hatred radiating from him was palpable, a toxic, suffocating force filling the expansive room. "You!" Edward snarled, his voice dropping to a demonic, vibrating hiss. "You ruined my entire life. You took my crown." "You took your own crown," Edward the First stated coldly, not backing down an inch. "I just handed you the mirror." Something inside the disgraced, broken prince snapped completely. With a guttural, furious scream, Edward lunged forward. He abandoned all pretense of sanity, throwing his entire body weight directly across the glass coffee table, his hands outstretched like desperate claws aiming straight for my throat to exact his final pathetic revenge. He never even made it halfway. Donovan moved with terrifying, blinding speed. It was not a chaotic, messy brawl. It was a masterclass in swift, tactical precision. Donovan stepped smoothly into Edward's path, catching the prince's outstretched, flailing arm. He pivoted his hips using Edward's own frantic, aggressive momentum entirely against him and drove his heavy shoulder directly into the prince's chest. The impact sounded like a brutal car crash. The heavy glass coffee table shattered into 1,000 glittering, jagged pieces as Donovan slammed Edward violently onto the floor. Before Edward could even register the shock or the pain, Donovan had his arm wrenched sharply and painfully behind his back, applying a vicious, agonizing pressure that pinned the disgraced royal face down against the hardwood floor. Donovan drove his knee firmly into the center of Edward's spine, completely immobilizing him in a textbook unbreakable tactical restraint. Edward thrashed wildly, screaming in pain and absolute fury, his face pressed firmly against the shattered glass and ruined velvet. "Get off me! I am the prince! I am the Prince of Valerius! You are a trespasser!" Donovan growled, his voice a low, lethal rumble that commanded absolute, terrified obedience. "Move one more muscle and I will break your arm in 3 different places." King Alistair gestured sharply. 2 of his own elite royal guards lunged forward, hauling the screaming, thrashing prince off the shattered glass. They clamped heavy steel restraints onto Edward's wrists, dragging him toward the door as he continued to hurl vicious, impotent threats. The king looked at me, a silent, grim nod of respect passing between us. The immediate threat to Aegis Protocol was officially dead. The global markets would recover from the synthetic panic. But the federal investigation that Donovan triggered had a secondary devastating blast radius I had not anticipated. It swept right through my own family. 1 week later, the crisp autumn wind whipped across the windshield of my car as I drove through the familiar, affluent suburban streets of my childhood. The federal forensic sweep of Edward's offshore accounts had exposed a vast, interconnected network of domestic accomplices. My parents, who had always resented my independent success and constantly demanded financial handouts to fund their lavish lifestyle, had allowed their private bank accounts to be used as transit nodes for the shell companies funding the attack against me. They claimed they did not know the origin of the money, but the cryptographic logs proved they were actively laundering funds in exchange for massive percentage cuts. The FBI arrested them both on charges of wire fraud and conspiracy. Their assets were instantly frozen. The massive colonial house they prized above all else, the house where I had grown up, feeling like a ghost in my own family, went straight into rapid foreclosure. I parked my car in the long, sweeping driveway. I was not there to gloat or bask in their downfall. I was there for a single specific purpose. I needed to retrieve a locked cedar box containing my late grandfather's belongings before the bank agents locked down the property permanently. My grandfather was the only person in my bloodline who had ever truly believed in me. He was the one who taught me how to code on an archaic terminal in the basement, while my parents dragged my sister to country club galas and celebrated her mediocre achievements. I pushed open the heavy mahogany front door, expecting the hollow echoing silence of an abandoned home. Instead, I heard the frantic rustling of paper, the clinking of expensive crystal, and the hurried, heavy thud of footsteps echoing from the upper floors. I stepped into the grand foyer and stopped dead in my tracks. The house was being systematically dismantled. My extended family, the aunts and uncles who had spent my entire life enabling my parents' toxic vanity and mocking my career choices, were swarming the property like vultures over a fresh carcass. Uncle Ted was pulling expensive oil paintings off the dining room walls and stacking them hastily near the back patio door. Cousin Sarah was wrapping my mother's sterling silver collection in protective foam, shoving pieces into a large cardboard box. And standing in the center of the living room, aggressively packing expensive porcelain figurines and silver picture frames into a massive canvas tote bag, was Aunt Marie. Aunt Marie froze as her eyes met mine. The sheer, unabashed greed on her face instantly contorted into a mask of vicious defensive rage. She dropped the tote bag, the porcelain clattering loudly against the hardwood floor, and marched directly toward me, her finger pointing like a weapon. "What are you doing here?" Aunt Marie shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly against the high vaulted ceilings of the living room. "You have absolutely no right to show your face in this house. You destroyed this family. You put your parents in jail. They put themselves in federal custody when they decided to launder millions of dollars for international cybercriminals, Aunt Marie." I replied, my voice dangerously flat and entirely devoid of emotion. "And it looks like you are currently trying to commit a felony of your own by looting a federally seized property before the bank auditors arrive." Aunt Marie's face flushed a mottled, ugly purple. She stepped closer, trying to use her physical presence to intimidate me, just as she had when I was a teenager. "We are simply securing family heirlooms before the bank steals everything your parents worked so hard to build. You are a heartless, selfish girl. You always were. You never cared about this family. You only ever cared about your computers and your grandfather's useless junk." I did not back down. I stepped into her personal space, forcing her to look directly into my eyes. "My grandfather's junk built the foundation of a billion-dollar tech architecture." I stated, my tone dropping to a lethal whisper that commanded absolute attention. "And we both know he intended for me to have it. I know exactly what you did, Marie. I know you helped my parents hide his true will 10 years ago." She flinched, a sudden flash of genuine panic crossing her eyes before she tried to cover it with manufactured outrage. "You stood right there in the lawyer's office and swore grandfather died intestate?" I continued, pressing the advantage, refusing to let her look away. "You helped them bury the legal document that explicitly left his vintage tech blueprints and his original patents to me. You helped them steal my inheritance because you all thought I was just an ugly, socially awkward geek who would never amount to anything. You wanted everything liquidated to fund my sister's wedding and your own lavish vacations. You do not know what you are talking about." Aunt Marie spat, her voice trembling slightly as she backed up a step, realizing her intimidation tactics were utterly useless against me now. "This is my sister's house. These are our family's possessions. You are a traitor to your own blood. Get off my property right now before I call the police for trespassing." I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. I simply smiled, reached into my leather jacket, and pulled out a freshly notarized heavy stock legal document. "I bought this house from the bank this morning in a direct cash transfer," I said slowly, unfolding the deed and holding it right up to her face so she could read the signature. "You have exactly 5 minutes to leave my property before I have you arrested for burglary." Aunt Marie stared at the heavy parchment paper, her eyes darting across the official bank seals and the bold notarized signatures. For a fleeting second, the sheer reality of the document registered on her face, but her entrenched arrogance quickly overrode her logic. She smacked the paper away with the back of her hand, her rings catching the light from the foyer chandelier. "This is a cheap forgery," Aunt Marie sneered, her voice cracking with desperate denial. "You think you can walk in here with a fake piece of paper and intimidate us? Your parents are federal criminals. The government is seizing everything. You do not have the money to buy a house like this." Uncle Ted dropped a priceless 19th century landscape painting onto the hardwood floor and stomped over to join his wife. His face was a mask of furious, entitled indignation. He pointed a thick finger inches from my nose. "You are a pathological liar, just like your father," Ted barked. "You are trying to scare us off so you can steal the silver for yourself. We are the rightful family. We are taking what belongs to us before the federal auditors lock the doors." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his smartphone, stabbing his thumb against the glass screen. "I am calling the precinct right now." Ted threatened, his face turning a blotchy red. "You are going to share a concrete cell with your corrupt, traitorous parents. I am going to have you arrested for breaking and entering harassment and document forgery." I did not flinch. I simply folded the deed, slid it back into my leather jacket, and crossed my arms over my chest. "Please do," I replied, my voice projecting a cold, unwavering calm. "Tell them to send 2 cruisers. You are going to need the extra room for all the stolen property you are trying to smuggle out the back door." Ted hit the dial button, pressing the phone to his ear. Within seconds, he was feeding a hysterical, entirely fabricated story to the emergency dispatcher. He claimed a violent intruder had forced her way into the foreclosed property, that I was threatening them with physical harm, and that they feared for their lives. Cousin Sarah, standing by the dining room table, dramatically clutched a velvet box containing my mother's diamond necklaces, nodding along as if she were the victim of a violent home invasion. Donovan stood silently by the front door, his broad shoulders resting casually against the mahogany frame. He checked his luxury watch, his expression completely unbothered by the chaotic screaming echoing through the house. 3 minutes, Donovan announced, his deep voice carrying easily over Aunt Marie's shrill insults. The wait was remarkably short. The distant, piercing wail of police sirens cut through the crisp autumn air, growing rapidly louder until the harsh flashing of red and blue lights illuminated the large bay windows of the living room. 2 police cruisers screeched to a halt in the driveway, their tires biting aggressively into the expensive gravel. 4 uniformed officers burst through the front door, their hands resting cautiously on their utility belts, their eyes scanning the room for the violent intruder Ted had reported. Aunt Marie did not waste a single second. She threw herself forward, collapsing into dramatic, heaving sobs as she rushed toward the lead officer. She grabbed the sleeve of his uniform, her face twisted into a mask of pure victimized terror. "Thank God you arrived," Marie wailed, pointing a shaking finger directly at me. "This woman is unhinged. Her parents were just arrested by the FBI for money laundering. The bank took this house and now she is trying to terrorize us. She broke in, threatened us with violence, and tried to steal our family heirlooms. Please, you have to arrest her." Cousin Sarah whimpered loudly from the corner, clutching the box of diamonds even tighter. Uncle Ted stood tall, puffing out his chest as he approached the officers. "She presented a fake deed, officer. She is completely delusional. Get her in handcuffs before she hurts someone." The lead officer gently detached Marie's gripping hands and stepped forward, his expression hardening as he looked at me and Donovan. "Step away from the family," the officer commanded, his voice sharp and authoritative. "Keep your hands where I can see them. We received a report of a violent home invasion." Donovan did not raise his hands. He moved with a slow, deliberate, and entirely non-threatening grace, reaching into the inner breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a thick, blue-backed legal folio and stepped smoothly between me and the advancing officers. "Officers, my name is Donovan Sterling." He stated, his tone carrying the lethal, polished authority of a man who commanded courtrooms for a living. "I am the senior legal counsel for Aegis Protocol and the personal attorney for Ms. Kendra, the rightful legal owner of this property." The lead officer paused, his brow furrowing in confusion. The caller stated the property was foreclosed and seized by the bank. "It was seized by the federal government at exactly 8 o'clock this morning," Donovan explained, his voice ringing with absolute clarity. "And at 9:15, my client purchased the estate in its entirety directly from the holding bank via an expedited cash transfer. The woman crying on your shoulder is not a victim, officer. She is currently attempting to commit grand larceny." Donovan handed the heavy legal folio directly to the lead officer. Inside, you will find the authenticated deed, the fully executed chain of title, and a certified letter of ownership from the Federal Holding Bank. Donovan continued, his dark eyes shifting to Aunt Marie, who had suddenly stopped crying. You will also find an emergency injunction and an immediate eviction notice signed by a federal judge exactly 2 hours ago. My client is not trespassing. She is standing in her own living room watching her extended family loot her property. The officer opened the folio. The house fell into a deadly, suffocating silence as he read the top page. His eyes scanned the embossed seals, the bank routing confirmations, and the signature of the federal judge. He looked up, his expression shifting from defensive suspicion to profound professional disgust. The officer turned slowly to face Aunt Marie. He looked at the heavy canvas tote bag overflowing with expensive porcelain figurines by her feet. He looked at the stack of priceless oil paintings Uncle Ted had piled by the door. He looked at the velvet box of diamonds clutched desperately in Cousin Sarah's hands. "Put the items down," the officer ordered, his voice dropping into a harsh, unforgiving register. Aunt Marie gasped, her face turning a sickly pale white. "What? You cannot listen to him. Those are fake. This is our family's house." The officer took a step toward her, his hand resting firmly on his radio. "Ma'am, this paperwork is completely authenticated. You are trespassing on private property. Put the bag down right now or I will arrest all 3 of you for burglary, grand theft, and filing a false police report." The absolute crushing humiliation hit the extended family like a physical blow. Uncle Ted's jaw dropped open, his blustering arrogance vanishing instantly. Cousin Sarah burst into genuine tears of panic, dropping the velvet box onto the dining table as if it had suddenly caught fire. Aunt Marie stood frozen, her eyes darting desperately around the room, looking for a way out of the trap she had built for herself. There was none. "Empty your pockets and step outside," the second officer commanded, unhooking his handcuffs from his belt. "Do it now." It was a parade of absolute disgrace. I stood silently beside Donovan as my aunts, uncles, and cousins were forced to empty their pockets onto the glass coffee table, surrendering silver spoons, expensive watches, and handfuls of cash they had scavenged from my parents' private safe. The police marched them out the front door, herding them down the long driveway in full view of the wealthy neighbors who had gathered on the sidewalks to watch the spectacle. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut, plunging the massive house into a sudden, echoing quiet. The chaotic energy of the looting was gone, replaced by the hollow stillness of a fallen empire. Donovan looked at me, a faint, satisfied smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "The perimeter is secure. The property is yours." I did not celebrate. I turned away from the piles of recovered valuables and walked slowly toward the grand, sweeping staircase. I climbed the carpeted steps, my hand trailing lightly along the polished oak banister. The afternoon sun filtered through the high skylights, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the silent air. I walked down the long, empty hallway, bypassing the opulent master suite and the sprawling guest rooms, until I reached the small, cramped bedroom at the very end of the corridor. My childhood room. The only place in this massive estate where I had ever felt safe. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me. The room was bare, stripped of furniture long ago, but the original hardwood floor remained untouched. I dropped to my knees near the old cast-iron radiator in the corner. I counted 3 boards from the wall, tracing my fingers over the familiar subtle gap in the wood. I pried the loose oak floorboard up, exposing the dark, dusty cavity beneath the joists. My breath caught in my throat as I reached my hand into the hollow space. My fingers brushed against cold, heavy metal. I pulled it out, resting it on my lap. It was a heavy, rusted metal lockbox. The paint was chipping and the brass hinges were tarnished green with age. It was my grandfather's hidden legacy, the very foundation of Aegis Protocol, safely waiting for me, exactly where he had told me to hide it all those years ago. I ran my thumbs over the twin brass latches of the rusted metal lockbox. The combination was a 4-digit sequence I had committed to memory when I was 10 years old, the year of my grandfather's birth. I spun the small corroded dials until they aligned perfectly. The heavy latches sprang open with a sharp metallic crack that echoed in the empty room. I lifted the heavy lid. The scent of aged paper, dried ink, and a faint hint of machine oil wafted up instantly, transporting me back to the countless hours I had spent sitting beside him in the basement workshop. Inside lay a meticulously organized collection of my grandfather's life. 3 thick leather-bound journals rested on top, their covers worn soft from years of constant handling. Beneath them were several tightly rolled architectural blueprints and a thick sealed manila envelope bearing the logo of a prominent intellectual property law firm. I carefully lifted the first journal and opened it to a random page. The pages were covered in his dense, precise handwriting. It was not a diary. It was a structural engineering log. Pages upon pages of complex algorithmic logic gates, cryptographic mesh designs, and theoretical coding frameworks. I unrolled the top blueprint. It was a hand-drafted schematic of a digital security architecture. I traced the intricate lines and branching command structures with my index finger. My heart began to hammer against my ribs with the force of a runaway freight train. I recognized the structural logic instantly. It was the absolute foundational skeleton of the Aegis Protocol. He had conceptualized the ultimate impenetrable digital defense network over a decade ago, long before the hardware even existed to support it. He had mapped out the exact self-healing encryption matrices I had spent the last 5 years coding in absolute isolation. I had not just created a revolutionary software. I had intuitively finished the masterpiece my grandfather had started. But the pride swelling in my chest was violently extinguished the moment I opened the sealed manila envelope. Inside was a thick stack of highly classified legal documents, bills of sale, and notarized patent transfer agreements. I pulled out the primary contract. The dates corresponded exactly to the final months of my grandfather's life, when the stroke had rendered him unable to speak or defend himself. My parents had not merely ignored his brilliance, they had ruthlessly monetized it. The betrayal documented. Nancy's. The signatures. My mother and father had utilized a hastily drafted medical power of attorney to seize absolute control of his intellectual property portfolio. The sale. They had quietly packaged all of his foundational patents, his coding blueprints, and his proprietary algorithms. But what is going on? The buyer. They sold the entire collection to Marcus Vance, the ruthless, predatory CEO of Vanguard Cybernetics, my current biggest industry rival. The price, $12 million. I flipped to the attached financial routing logs. The ledger was a grotesque roadmap of their superficial greed. The $12 million from Marcus Vance did not go into a trust. It did not go toward my grandfather's medical care. It went directly into funding Brittany's impossibly lavish lifestyle. I saw the itemized bank transfers. $2 million drained to pay for Brittany's absurd week-long destination wedding in Lake Como. $3 million funneled into launching her doomed luxury fashion boutique that went bankrupt within a year. Hundreds of thousands spent on European sports cars, designer wardrobes, and country club initiation fees. My parents had not just stolen my identity to cover their crimes. They had literally sold my grandfather's genius to a corporate predator just to buy their golden child a few years of hollow manufactured socialite status. They had cannibalized a technological revolution to pay for superficial vanity. I sat on the dusty floorboards, clutching the documents against my chest. The revelation was staggering, but the ultimate payoff was profoundly vindicating. Marcus Vance had purchased the patents, but he lacked the fundamental vision to understand them. He had locked the blueprints away, utilizing only fragments of the code to build his mediocre, vulnerable security firm. He never saw the big picture. I pulled out my encrypted military-grade tablet and opened the core source code of Aegis Protocol. I held it side by side with the faded hand-drawn blueprints. They matched perfectly. My multi-billion-dollar algorithm was not an isolated stroke of luck. It was the perfected ultimate evolution of my grandfather's stolen dream. I had reclaimed our legacy without even realizing it. The empire I had built was the absolute proof of our shared bloodline, A monumental victory over the mediocre, greedy relatives who had tried to bury us both. Aegis Protocol was unassailable because its roots were forged in genuine brilliance, not corporate theft. A sudden, violent crash shattered the profound silence of the empty house. The heavy mahogany front door downstairs was kicked open with tremendous splintering force. The sound of heavy tactical boots slamming against the marble foyer echoed up the grand staircase like rapid gunfire. I snapped my tablet shut and shoved it into the lockbox, snapping the brass latches closed. I stood up, my heart racing, and stepped cautiously out of my childhood bedroom into the long, shadowed hallway. I crept toward the carved oak banister and peered over the edge into the grand foyer below. Standing in the center of the shattered entryway, brushing wood splinters off the shoulder of his immaculate custom-tailored suit, was Marcus Vance. He was not alone. The ruthless tech billionaire was flanked by 4 massive, heavily armed corporate fixers wearing unmarked black tactical gear. They moved with terrifying professional precision, instantly securing the exits and fanning out across the ground floor. Marcus Vance looked up, his cold, predatory eyes locking onto mine through the shadows of the upper landing. He spotted the rusted metal lockbox clutched tightly against my side. A slow, chilling smile spread across his face, entirely devoid of warmth. "Bring that box downstairs right now, Kendra," Marcus Vance commanded, his voice echoing with absolute terrifying authority. "Your parents sold me the foundation of your company 10 years ago. Aegis Protocol belongs to me. Hand over the original blueprints or my men will tear this house apart with you inside it." I did not run. I did not scream. I held the rusted metal lockbox tightly against my side and walked slowly down the grand sweeping staircase, my boots clicking rhythmically against the polished oak steps. Marcus Vance watched me descend, his lip curling into a sneer of absolute toxic entitlement. He snapped his fingers, and one of his tactical fixers handed him a thick sealed leather folder. Vance pulled out a crisp, notarized document and slapped it aggressively onto the entryway console table. "I have an airtight binding purchase agreement signed by Patricia and Richard Valerius Vance," stated, his voice dripping with arrogance. "They legally liquidated every single intellectual property asset within this estate to Vanguard Cybernetics 10 years ago. Your grandfather's code is mine. Your current software architecture is a direct derivative of my property. I own Aegis Protocol, Kendra. Hand over the physical patents right now, or my men will tear this house apart with you inside it." "You bought stolen goods from thieves," I replied, my voice remarkably steady as I reached the bottom step. "My grandfather never transferred those rights to my parents. They forged the probate documents. Vanguard Cybernetics, the industry giant you claim to have built from scratch, is nothing but a fraudulent shell constructed on my grandfather's stolen genius." Vance laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. "Do you really think I care about the ethical origins of the code I paid $12 million for the foundation of a digital empire? I used that code to build Vanguard. And now that you have conveniently perfected the self-healing algorithm, I am here to collect the final piece of the puzzle. Give me the box or we will take it by force." He nodded sharply. The 4 massive fixers stepped forward in terrifying unison. Their heavy tactical gear creaked as they cracked their knuckles, their hands resting menacingly near the holstered weapons on their belts. They fanned out to block my path to the front door, attempting to box me into the corner of the foyer. They were trained to intimidate, to use overwhelming physical presence to crush civilian resistance. One of the men, a towering brute with a scarred jawline and dead eyes, reached out to grab my shoulder. He never made contact. Donovan materialized from the shadows of the formal dining room with the terrifying speed of a striking viper. He did not throw a punch or draw a weapon. He stepped seamlessly between me and the advancing brute, his broad shoulders forming an impenetrable physical wall. He adjusted his tailored suit jacket with chilling, meticulous calm. "If you touch my client, you will forfeit your right hand," Donovan said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that stopped the fixer dead in his tracks. "And if you take one more step onto this property, Marcus, you will spend the rest of your natural life in a federal penitentiary." Vance sneered, waving a dismissive hand. You brought a corporate lawyer to a physical extraction. You are completely out of your depth, counselor. I have a signed contract. My men are simply securing my legal assets. You have a confession, Donovan corrected instantly, his tone razor-sharp and lethal. That contract is a documented receipt for purchasing stolen goods. The seller, Patricia Valerius, never held legal title to Theodore's intellectual property. She committed probate fraud to acquire it. By entering this property today with armed men to extract assets by force, you have escalated your crimes from possession of stolen property to armed extortion, corporate espionage, and racketeering under the RICO Act. Your presence here is a textbook non-bailable felony. Vance scoffed, his face flushing with angry, mottled red patches. Save the courtroom theatrics for a judge in 5 years. By the time you manage to file an injunction, I will have reverse-engineered the core algorithm and wiped Aegis Protocol off the global market. Take the box. The fixers braced themselves to rush us. I stepped out from behind Donovan, my posture perfectly straight, my expression entirely unbothered. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my encrypted smartphone. The screen was glowing bright red, displaying a live active video feed. The recording timer showed 35 minutes. "We are not waiting for a Judge Marcus," I stated, my voice echoing clearly through the grand foyer. "I am not relying on a delayed civil suit. I am currently logged into a secure encrypted bridge connecting directly to the FBI Cybercrimes Task Force, the exact same federal task force that arrested my parents this morning for wire fraud." Vance froze. The color rapidly drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly and hollow. His eyes darted to the glowing red recording icon on my phone. "They have been monitoring this live feed since you kicked down my front door," I continued, mercilessly driving the nail into his coffin. "You just confessed on a federal wire to knowingly purchasing stolen intellectual property from money launderers. You admitted to using that stolen code to build Vanguard Cybernetics. You brought armed corporate mercenaries across state lines to commit extortion on a federally seized property." The reality of the situation began to crush the arrogant CEO. His mouth opened and closed silently as he realized the magnitude of his fatal error. "You did not just secure your own arrest, Marcus," I said, stepping closer, holding the lockbox like a shield. "You just handed the federal government the exact evidence they need to liquidate Vanguard entirely. And the best part, that $12 million you paid my parents. That was the slush fund keeping my sister Brittany afloat. You were her ultimate corporate backer, feeding her vanity with stolen money. By exposing this, you have completely destroyed her financial safety net. She has absolutely nothing left, and neither do you." The suffocating silence in the foyer was suddenly broken by a sound that made Vance's blood run cold. Sirens. The distant high-pitched wail of police cruisers and heavy tactical federal vehicles began to echo down the affluent suburban street, multiplying in volume with every passing second. The red and blue lights began to flash frantically against the shattered glass of the front entryway, casting eerie, frantic shadows across the foyer walls. Vance's arrogance evaporated into pure, unadulterated panic. "We are leaving!" he screamed at his men, his voice cracking with sheer desperation. "Get to the transport vehicles right now! Move!" He lunged toward the heavy mahogany front doors, desperate to escape the trap he had brazenly walked into. Donovan moved faster. He pivoted on his heel and slammed the heavy oak double doors shut with a thunderous crash. He dropped the massive deadbolt into place and planted his broad, immovable frame directly against the wood, crossing his arms and blocking the only viable exit. "You are not going anywhere," Donovan growled, his eyes locking onto the terrified CEO with predatory satisfaction. "Your meeting with the federal authorities is about to begin." The realization hit Vance with the force of a physical blow. He stumbled backward, his knees buckling slightly as the federal agents swarmed the front porch, their heavy fists pounding aggressively against the wood. The final piece of Brittany's corporate backing crumbled to dust as the CEO raised his trembling hands in complete pathetic surrender. 6 months later, the suffocating tension of that afternoon had been replaced by the sterile freezing and absolute authority of a federal courtroom in downtown Manhattan. The heavy mahogany doors of the courthouse were closed, sealing us inside a room where wealth and status held absolutely no currency against hard cryptographic evidence. I sat in the front row of the gallery, my posture perfectly straight, my hands resting calmly on my lap. Donovan sat beside me, exuding the quiet, lethal confidence of a predator watching a trap spring shut. Across the center aisle, sitting at the polished defense table, were my parents Patricia and Richard, alongside my sister Brittany. They were stripped of their designer suits, their custom-tailored gowns, and their diamond accessories. They wore matching, shapeless khaki federal jumpsuits. They looked small, pale, and entirely unremarkable. The defense attorney stood at the podium. He was a high-priced litigator, sweating profusely under the unforgiving fluorescent lights, desperately trying to salvage an utterly unsalvageable case. He adjusted his glasses, attempting to project an aura of sympathetic reason. "Your Honor." The defense attorney began, his voice dripping with a manufactured, cloying sincerity. "What we have before us today is not a malicious, organized criminal enterprise. It is a tragedy. This is a simple family misunderstanding that spiraled tragically out of control. Richard and Patricia are loving parents. They made a misguided, desperate financial error trying to secure a legacy for their children. They lacked the technical comprehension to understand the true value of Theodore's blueprints. And Brittany. Your Honor is a naive young woman who was merely caught in the crossfire of her parents' ambitions. They ask for leniency, probation, and a chance to heal their fractured family privately." The attorney stepped back, wiping his brow. Brittany slowly turned her head toward the gallery. Her eyes locked onto mine. She deployed the exact same manipulative tactic she had used since childhood. Her lower lip quivered. Her large eyes welled with moisture. A single perfectly calculated tear traced its way down her cheek. She mouthed the words, "I am sorry," trying to bridge the impassable chasm between us, with a performance designed purely for the judge's benefit. I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no pity, no residual familial guilt. I simply stared back at her with the cold, assessing gaze of a CEO looking at a neutralized threat. "Ms. Valerius," the federal judge announced, his voice booming over the courtroom microphone. "The prosecution has submitted a request for a victim impact statement. The floor is yours." I stood up. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored charcoal suit and walked down the center aisle, passing the defense table without a single sideways glance. I stepped up to the wooden podium, adjusted the microphone, and looked directly up at the judge. "Your Honor," I began, my voice ringing with icy, undeniable clarity. "The defense has just asked this court to view a coordinated multi-million-dollar money laundering operation as a simple family misunderstanding. A family misunderstanding is an argument over holiday dinner arrangements. Stealing a deceased relative's foundational technological patents, forging probate documents, and selling that stolen intellectual property to a corporate predator for $12 million is grand larceny and federal fraud." The courtroom fell into a dead, absolute silence. I did not raise my voice, but the weight of the facts struck like a hammer. Richard and Patricia Valerius did not make a misguided financial error. I continued, my tone entirely merciless. They executed a highly calculated, malicious transaction. They actively laundered $12 million through offshore shell companies in Cyprus and the Cayman Islands. They did not use those funds to secure a family legacy. They used that stolen money to exclusively finance Brittany's lavish synthetic lifestyle. They bought sports cars, funded a bankrupt luxury boutique, and paid for European vacations while I worked 80-hour weeks to build Aegis Protocol from scratch. I turned slightly, casting a brief, freezing glance at the defense table. Patricia was staring at the table, her face bright red. Richard was shaking his head in silent, impotent denial. "But their greed did not stop at theft," I stated, turning my attention back to the judge. "When my company Aegis Protocol threatened their buyer's market share, they escalated their crimes. Brittany personally authorized a state-sponsored deepfake attack designed to destroy my reputation and crash global financial markets. She hired international cyber mercenaries. She funded a digital smear campaign using the exact same laundered money they stole from my grandfather. They operated a criminal syndicate disguised as suburban respectability. They stripped away any illusion of family loyalty the moment they decided to cannibalize my grandfather's genius. to fund their own vanity. I placed my hands firmly on the edges of the podium, leaning forward slightly. Blood does not excuse racketeering. Shared DNA does not grant immunity from corporate espionage. They are remorseless, predatory opportunists who would have gladly watched me go to federal prison for their crimes. I am formally requesting that this court impose the maximum sentencing guidelines available under federal law. They must be permanently removed from society to ensure they can never victimize, manipulate, or steal from anyone ever again. I stepped away from the podium and walked calmly back to my seat. Donovan offered a single respectful nod. The judge looked down at his notes, his face a rigid mask of profound judicial disgust. He adjusted his robes and glared directly at the defense table. "I have presided over this court for 2 decades," the judge stated, his voice echoing with terrifying finality. "I have rarely seen a case of such astonishing callous greed perpetrated against a person's own flesh and blood. The defense's attempt to frame this as a domestic dispute is an insult to the intelligence of this court. The cryptographic evidence, the wire transfers, and the digital logs are irrefutable. You operated an organized fraud ring out of sheer unadulterated selfishness." The judge picked up his gavel. "Richard and Patricia Valerius, you are hereby sentenced to 10 years each in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. Brittany Valerius, for your active organizing role in corporate espionage, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit cyber terrorism, you are sentenced to 7 years in federal prison." Brittany gasped loudly, a horrific, genuine sound of absolute panic escaping her throat as her knees buckled against the defense table. Patricia buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. Richard sat frozen, staring blankly at the wall as his entire world vanished. The heavy wooden gavel struck the sounding block. The sharp, explosive crack echoed through the massive room, signaling the absolute permanent end of their reign. Court is adjourned. Federal marshals instantly stepped forward, securing heavy steel cuffs around their wrists. I did not stay to watch them being dragged away through the side doors. I turned my back on the empty shell of my former family and walked out of the courtroom doors into the bright, blinding sunlight of the city, finally and completely free. Exactly 1 year later, the crisp alpine air of Geneva replaced the suffocating memory of that Manhattan courtroom. The grand ballroom of the Palais des Nations glowed under the brilliant light of 10,000 suspended crystals. I stood near the sweeping archways overlooking the pristine dark waters of Lake Geneva, taking in the absolute magnitude of the evening. The Global Cyber Defense Gala was the most exclusive, heavily guarded event on the European continent, and tonight, I was its center of gravity. There were no more corporate spies lurking in the shadows. There were no more predatory relatives plotting to steal my grandfather's legacy. The war was over and the victory was absolute. Donovan stood beside me, his formidable presence softened only by the immaculate cut of his bespoke midnight blue tuxedo. He adjusted his silver cufflinks, his dark eyes scanning the room with the practiced vigilance of a man who missed absolutely nothing, but there was a profound, unmistakable peace in his posture. We had spent the last 12 months integrating the Aegis Protocol into the core infrastructure of the global banking system and national defense grids. My grandfather's theoretical blueprints were now the impenetrable shield protecting billions of people. A sudden hush fell over the magnificent ballroom as King Alistair approached the gold-leafed podium at the center of the grand stage. He was a man of commanding presence representing the unified European alliance, and his voice carried a deep, resonant authority that demanded instant respect from the assembled crowd. We live in an era where our most valuable assets, our security, our identities, and our futures exist entirely in the digital ether. King Alistair began his gaze sweeping across the gathered elite of global leaders and tech innovators. For years, we fought a losing battle against those who would exploit that ether for their own malicious greed. But tonight, we celebrate a visionary who changed the fundamental architecture of global security, a woman who defended her legacy with unparalleled brilliance. The king gestured toward me, and a brilliant, blinding spotlight immediately illuminated my position in the gallery. It is my profound honor to officially appoint Ms. Kendra Valerius as the Chief Cybersecurity Advisor for the European Alliance. King Alastair announced, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. The applause was deafening. It washed over me in a massive, overwhelming wave of genuine validation. I walked down the center aisle, my emerald silk gown trailing elegantly across the polished marble floor. I climbed the carpeted steps to the stage, shaking the king's hand as he presented me with a heavy diamond-encrusted insignia of office. I looked out over the sea of faces, feeling a surge of pride that transcended anything my parents could have ever stolen from me. I had not just survived their betrayal. I had conquered the world they had so desperately tried to manipulate. Thousands of miles away, the deafening applause of Geneva was violently replaced by the harsh metallic clatter of tin trays and the sickening stench of industrial bleach. Inside the stark, fluorescent-lit cafeteria of the Federal Correctional Institution in Danbury, Connecticut, Brittany Valerius fell heavily to her hands and knees. She was wearing a faded, shapeless khaki uniform that hung loosely over her diminished, exhausted frame. Her perfectly manicured hands, once accustomed only to designer bags and champagne flutes, were now raw, cracked, and blistered from harsh chemical cleaners. She dipped a coarse, bristled brush into a yellow plastic bucket of murky, gray, soapy water and began aggressively scrubbing the deep black scuff marks off the unforgiving linoleum floor. She wiped a bead of greasy sweat from her forehead with the back of her wrist. Her hair was tied back in a messy, unwashed knot, entirely stripped of its former manufactured glamour. She looked up her shoulders, aching with a deep, miserable exhaustion. Mounted inside a heavy wire cage in the upper corner of the cafeteria, a small television was broadcasting the international news network. The volume was muted, but the high-definition image was unmistakably clear. Brittany froze her breath, catching painfully in her throat. On the screen, she saw me. She saw her sister standing radiant and powerful on a global stage, accepting an honor from a king. She saw the glittering emerald gown, the flashing cameras, and the sheer, untouchable magnitude of my triumph. Brittany dropped her scrub brush. It splashed heavily into the bucket, sending dirty water soaking into the knees of her prison uniform. She stared at the screen, her chest heaving with a suffocating, agonizing misery. She had traded $1 billion empire for a few fleeting years of counterfeit luxury, and now trapped in a concrete box scrubbing floors for pennies, she was forced to watch me rule the world she could never touch. Back in the golden warmth of the Geneva ballroom, I descended the marble steps as the wealthy crowd parted with deep, respectful deference. Donovan was waiting for me at the base of the stairs, a rare, genuine smile illuminating his handsome features. He reached out, handing me a crystal flute filled with sparkling vintage champagne. To the architect, Donovan said softly, his deep voice meant only for me, cutting seamlessly through the ambient noise of the massive celebration. I raised my glass, the fine crystal catching the light of the chandeliers above. I looked into his eyes, seeing the unwavering loyalty and brilliant mind that had stood as an impenetrable wall between me and total ruin. To truth, I replied, my voice steady and full of absolute conviction. To raw talent and to an unbreakable partnership. The crystal flutes met with a crisp musical chime. I took a sip of the champagne, letting the cool, crisp taste ground me in the perfection of the moment. We turned together, walking slowly toward the towering arched glass windows at the far end of the grand hall. The perspective seemed to widen, pulling back through the massive panes of glass, leaving the warmth and music of the gala behind. The reflection of the glittering ballroom faded into the pristine dark expanse of Lake Geneva below, while the majestic snow-capped peaks of the Alps stood eternal against the night sky. The ultimate sweet revenge was not just watching my enemies fall. It was knowing my grandfather's legacy would live forever, and that my independence was finally absolutely my own. True legacy is never built on theft or entitlement. It is forged through resilience, brilliance, and authenticity. The profound betrayal by those who were supposed to protect you is devastating, but it does not dictate your ultimate worth. Instead of exhausting yourself seeking validation from a toxic family, you must build your own empire on a foundation of absolute truth. When the dust finally settles, unchecked greed will inevitably consume itself, while unwavering integrity stands the test of time. True justice is found in reclaiming your stolen power, walking away, and letting your undeniable success be your ultimate revenge.